The War of Civilizations. Prologue. Throughout history, humanity has looked to the sky with a desire to understand what lies beyond. But the truth, hidden in layers of myth and shadow, was much closer than they could have ever imagined. Beneath the ice of Antarctica, in the depths of the earth and in the stars that watched over it, two pillars of cosmic existence united for the first time in front of people. The Gorduy, the giant builders, heirs of stone and ancestral memory, and the Elyrians, beings of light and spirit, keepers of universal harmony. Alongside them appeared two legendary figures, Eryon-Tal, known among people as Lieutenant Liam, nicknamed the Bridge of Light, and Sael-Rien Lieutenant Naomi, the Witness of Life, read Trilogy-Beyond Antarctica. They were messengers between worlds, sent to bring unity between Earth and the stars. But humanity was not prepared. When the Gorduy and Elyan ships descended into the sky, leaving behind bright lights that lit up the oceans and deserts, people watched with fear, not understanding. Fear turned to suspicion, suspicion to hostility, and hostility to war. The first fire was fired not by the Gorduy or the Elyans, but by humans. Fearing to lose their power, the governments of the world declared invasion, and thus began the War of Civilizations, a conflict that would last a century of flames and ash. Cities burned by human weapons and entire plains lit by the energies of the Gorduy, a century in which the Elyans raised shields of light, not to destroy, but to protect. But with each year, with each battle, the balance between civilizations crumbled. Eryon-Tal and Sael-Rien remained between the fronts, carrying the burden of being the link between two worlds that could no longer understand each other. They were the hope of a common future, but also witnesses to a deepening tragedy. This is not just a war of arms. It is a war of fear against light, of memory against oblivion, of man against himself. And now, after 100 years, the world asks itself, who will survive? The united civilizations or the humanity that refused to listen? Chapter 1. The Descent of the Two Civilizations. The sky of Earth had never been so alive. On a night that should have been like any other, people watched as the stars changed their positions, forming impossible geometric circles and lines. Astronomers, military men, and poets alike looked up to that symphony of light, convinced that they were living an unrepeatable moment. Beyond the blue atmosphere, beyond the orbit of the moon, two colossal ships advanced. Like floating continents, One seemed to be built of living stone, immense, with black crystal edges and corners reminiscent of ancient temples. The other was unlike anything humans could have conceived. It was fluid, translucent, ever-changing, as if light itself had gathered in the shape of an arch. Was Gorduy and the Elyrians, returning to Earth. No one had ever truly believed in legends. The pyramids, sphinxes, stone temples scattered around the world had been seen only as relics of an overly ambitious human civilization. But that night, the truth rose above any theory. The Gorduy giants, builders of the first monuments, were returning. Alongside them, the people of light, the Elyrians, those beings that the ancient manuscripts spoke of as celestial messengers, were showing themselves again. Their goal was not conquest, but healing. The first days of the descent were a mixture of amazement and fear. The huge ships anchored near desert areas, far from cities, so as not to cause panic. However, the energy waves emanating from them were felt hundreds of kilometers away, shaking technological instruments and causing earthquakes of light. When the Gorduy giants stepped on the earth, the world fell silent. They were 5 meters tall, their bodies covered in a kind of organic armor, as if the stone itself was their flesh. Each of their steps made the ground vibrate, but their eyes showed no cruelty, but a deep melancholy, as of beings who carried the weight of millions of years of memories. They were the keepers of Øryon-Tal, the stone of memory, the relic in which each generation of Gorduy had deposited its echo. The Elyrians, on the other hand, emerged like solidified rays of sunlight. Human silhouettes, but translucent, as if the light had drawn their bodies. They moved gracefully, sometimes floating a few centimeters above the ground, and when they touched people, they felt an inner peace, like a deep relief. They carried 𝕭𝖭, the heart of knowledge, the sphere that pulsated with the light of life and could connect the mind with the universe. At first, people watched with awe. Many fell to their knees, convinced that the gods were returning. But the leaders, accustomed to viewing everything through the prism of power, raised questions. Why now? What do they want from us? What does their peace really mean? The initial meeting between the two civilizations and humanity took place in a huge crystal hall, erected by the Elyrians in a single night, above the ruins of an ancient fortress. Dozens of human leaders were invited there. Entering, they saw how the transparent walls reflected not only their faces, but also memories from the past, wars, inventions, moments of suffering and glory. It was as if the building itself had read their souls, and in the center of the hall stood the two people who had been chosen as intermediaries, Eryon-Tal, Lieutenant Liam, the Bridge of Light, and Sael-Rien, Lieutenant Naomi, the Witness of Life. Even before the delegations arrived, they carried the sacred relics within them. Their oath, taken on the planet Elyan, had given them a role as a link between the worlds. The Gorduy spoke first, through the voice of 𝕭𝖊, the oldest of them. His voice, it was like thunder rolling deep in the mountain. I came not to conquer you, but to remind you. The earth is our common home. We built the first stones to show you the way to the stars. But you have forgotten. We have come to remind you that you are more than warriors of your fear. The Elyrians continued, through Saratha's voice, a crystalline sound like a harp. We kindled the light of your thought. We watched when you discovered fire, when you raised your eyes to the sky and wondered where you came from. We are not gods, but older brothers. And we have returned to share peace, not the sword. The hall vibrated with emotion, but also with suspicion. People looked towards the Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life. The two seemed at the same time fragile and frighteningly powerful. Carrying the traces of other worlds in their gazes, Eryon-Tal rose. His voice, amplified by Eryon-Tal, the memory stone of the Gorduy civilization, rang out clearly. They do not want to lead us, but to teach us. I swore to be the bridge between them and you, to convey the truth, not the lie. I know that fear is great, but fear only breeds war. Sael-Rien completed him, touching the luminous sphere of 𝕭𝖭, memory of the Elyrian civilization, with his hand. I have seen the future. If we refuse this gift, only destruction awaits us. If we accept it, we can flourish again. And those early days, two camps formed among the leaders of Earth. Some wanted to accept the gift of peace. Others saw in Gorduy and the Elyrians a threat to their own authority. How could there be kings, presidents, or generals, if beings of light and immortal giants appeared before them? And then the question arose that shook the balance. What happened to the kidnapped people? With Eryon-Tal, Lieutenant Liam, and Sael-Rien, Lieutenant Naomi. When the truth came out, that they were not prisoners, but allies of the civilizations, suspicion exploded. Many cried out that these two were no longer human, that they had been transformed, corrupted. How can our voice be heard if they are no longer among us? In the nights that followed, many people dreamed of the faces of Elyrians. They woke up crying or calm, as if touched by an unseen power. And other places, soldiers swore that they had seen giant Gorduy standing guard near ancient temples, silent watchmen who did not touch anyone. But the governments were afraid, and their fear began to give birth to hidden plans. The descent of the two civilizations was not an act of domination, but a calling. They brought with them gifts, healing technologies, knowledge of the cosmos, memories of the early days of humanity. But instead of applause, they received suspicion. Instead of gratitude, they received accusations. And in the eyes of the two witnesses, the Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life, the heavy burden of the future was already felt. They knew that the oath taken on Elyan would not be easy to bear, because humanity, instead of seeing an outstretched hand, saw a shadow that had to be chased away. Thus began the story. Not with raised weapons, not with explosions, but with a smoldering distrust. The descent of the two civilizations had been a gift, a call to peace. But for humans, peace was a suspicious word. And in that mixture of light and suspicion, the spark of a war that would last a century was already born. Chapter 2: Fear of Men. The earth had not been quiet since the descent. The Gorduy and Elyan ships hung above the desert, shining in the night like two cold suns, and every man knew that the world could never be the same again. But what could have been the beginning of an era of peace slowly turned into a cloud of suspicion. And nothing ignited the spark of fear more strongly than the disappearance of the two witnesses. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life, it was Eryon-Tal, Lieutenant Liam, and Sael-Rien. Lieutenant Naomi had been taken by the fallen civilizations. Without public explanation, without being shown to the people again. The two had become for many the symbols of the alliance, proof that Gorduy and the Elyans had not come as masters, but as brothers. But their absence, even for a few days, raised the question, if they were kidnapped? The first rumors started in the council chambers, where generals and presidents, locked between concrete walls and cold lights, were coldly debating the fate of humanity. "No one can prove that the two left willingly," said a northern leader, banging his fist on the table. "They disappeared. For our peoples, this is evidence of hostility. Or a sign that something is being prepared," added another. "Maybe they are transforming them, maybe they are using them as weapons. How can we trust beings who don't even breathe like us? Gorduy and the Elyrians claim to offer us peace, but every imposed peace is a disguised conquest," murmured someone else. No one was talking about the real problem, the loss of control. The fall of the two civilizations had shaken the world order. What was the point of borders, armies, military strategies, when 5-meter beings could build temples in a single night, and people of light could read thoughts? Behind the speeches about security and protection, there was actually the fear of being replaced, of becoming useless. Newspapers and networks turned the rumor into truth. Huge headlines read, "The witnesses have been kidnapped," or "Gorduy and the Elyrians are preparing total domination." Photos of colossal ships, giants walking through the sand and Elyrians floating above the water were presented with alarmist subtitles. "Monsters who will be our masters. Their light will burn us." Ordinary people, those who watched the screens in the squares or in poor houses, found themselves caught between amazement and panic, and the cities. Crowds came out to demand answers. Where are the bridge and the witness? Are they alive? Or have they been destroyed? Some worshipped them, painting their faces on the walls, calling them heaven's chosen ones. Others hated them, shouting that they had betrayed their species and that they were already something else, and the desert, the Elyrians and the Gorduy watched with anxiety at the reactions of the people. They did not fully understand the power of human fear. For them, the absence of the two was natural. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life had undergone a process of interweaving energies, an initiation, through which they would be able to clearly transmit the message of civilizations. But they had not understood how much humanity had become attached to those figures. One night, Sereth, the wisest of the Elyrians, said to his brothers, "I gave people a spark of truth, and they turned it into a sword. Their fear is a flame that will burn both the gift and the darkness." And Thamrose, the old Gorduy, looked at him in silence, knowing that in the eyes of men, stone and light could just as easily be seen as chains. Fear had become fuel for those who sought power, and in the halls of government, generals were already proposing plans, consolidating arsenals, uniting states under a common front. If these foreigners want to rule us, we must show them that we are not slaves, we have weapons, we have fire. And so, in the name of security, humanity prepared for war against beings who had not even picked up weapons, and villages and cities. Simple people were the most affected. Some prayed to the sky, convinced that the end of the world was coming. Others organized guards, convinced that the Gorduys would steal their children and the markets of the East. Storytellers said that the Witness of Life had been torn apart by the light of the Elyrians, and the Bridge of Light had been transformed into a stone colossus in the west. Conspiracy theories said that the two had never existed, that everything had been a setup to lull humanity to sleep before the conquest. Every rumor was a seed, and from every seed grew fear. One day, a gathering of thousands of people gathered in the capital of one of the great states. The crowd carried banners and shouted, "Bring back the witnesses! We do not want false gods! Down with the traitors!" In the midst of the protest, a young boy, his eyes burning with fanaticism, stood on a statue and shouted, "If they do not release them, we will defeat them. The earth belongs to men, not to giants and shadows of light." His cry was taken up by the crowd, transformed into a battle song, and the generals, looking at the images on the screens, smiled. For them, the proof was clear: the people demand war. All this time, the Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life were in a crystal hall, somewhere between the Elyrian ships. They were not prisoners, but initiates. Around them, the energies of stone and light merged, flooding their bodies. They saw visions of the future, battles, burned cities, but also fragments of peace, of rebirth. They knew that the time of initiation was short, and that, once they returned, the world would look at them differently, perhaps as saviors, perhaps as traitors. Eryon-Tal said to Sael-Rien, as the light penetrated his skin, "If they do not understand the truth, everything we do will turn against them." Sael-Rien looked at him, with tears of light in her eyes. "Then we must not only tell them, we must be prepared to suffer for them." But humanity did not want to wait any longer. The absence of the two had become the ultimate proof that the descended beings had not brought peace, but threat. One night, when the sky was covered with a storm, a secret council of the great powers came together. Their decision was simple and terrible. "We cannot remain passive. If they use them against us, if they turn the bridge and the witness into weapons, it will be too late. We must attack first." Thus, fear turned into strategy, and suspicion into a declaration of war. The descent of the two civilizations had been seen at first as a gift from the gods. But people, through their fear, rewrote it in their memory as the beginning of an invasion. The kidnapping of the Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life had not been a crime, but an initiation. But, in the eyes of people, the truth no longer mattered. All that mattered was that humanity felt threatened. And when people feel threatened, they take up arms. Thus began the first bell of war. Chapter 3. The Oath on Elyan. Above the planet Elyan, the vertical oceans burned in blue reflections, flowing from the sky like boundless waterfalls, and the air vibrated like an ancestral song. Here, time was not a succession of moments, but a breath of the universe. T was the place where earthly and cosmic reality met, and every step taken echoed through the ages. T, the center of this torch planet. In a crystal hall suspended between gravities, the Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life stood before the six beings who represented the Gorduy and Elyan civilizations. For several days they had lived the initiation. They had felt how the energies of the universe penetrated their bodies and minds. But now the solemn moment had come, the irreversible moment, the oath. The transparent crystal floor revealed an ocean flowing backwards beneath, rising towards the vault of the sky, as if the entire planet defied the laws known to men. Above them, the ceiling reflected unknown constellations, arcs of light that formed living symbols, as if the sky itself wanted to bear witness. The Gorduy, giants of stone and memory, stood aligned like colossi of eternity, and in their midst stood Thamros, the oldest, carrying in his massive hands a huge crystal that seemed carved from the heart of a star. T was Oryn-Tal, the stone of memory. T glowed with an inner fire, but it was not a fire of destruction, but one of remembrance. Each spark a fragment of the past, a generation, a voice in the endless string of Gorduy history. Before them stood Sael-Rien, the leader of the Elyrians, a being of light that radiated calm and wisdom, and his palms, between his translucent fingers, pulsed a living sphere, like a small sun shining white-gold. T was Elyr, the heart of Elyrian knowledge. T was not just an object, but a living consciousness, a flow of thoughts, revelations, and power of spirit. The ceremony began when Thamros stepped forward, and his voice echoed through the hall like an earthquake. Bridge of Light, son of men, today we entrust you with Eryon-Tal, our memory. T contains the echo of all the steps we have taken since the universe was only a dream. If you remain pure and sincere, the stone will speak to you, guide you, and show you the way. But if you betray the oath, it will close for you, becoming heavier than mountains and dumber than death. The giant bent the stone, and its light reflected in his eyes bridges of light. The man felt a new weight in his body, but also an unwavering strength. It was as if every breath of the Gorduy civilization touched him, whispering to him, "You are not just you, you are our entire past." Then Sael-Rien came closer, and his crystalline voice spread like a wave on the surface of the water. "Witness of life, you who came with an open heart, you are the support and the connection. We entrust to you Elyr, our heart. She will pulse with your thoughts, but she will only offer you as much as you can bear. Too much light can blind, too much truth can crush. But with love and balance, you will be the voice that brings harmony between word and heart." The sphere of light approached her palms, and, the moment the witness of life touched her, a sweet warmth enveloped her body. She felt waves of images, ideas, and ancient truths, as if her mind was expanding in an endless sea. And yet, in the midst of this ocean of knowledge, she also felt her own love for the Bridge of Light, an anchor that held her above the depths. The decisive moment came when the two were called to touch Eryon-Tal and Elyr at the same time. The crystal and the sphere were placed in the center of the hall, side by side, like two hearts of the universe waiting to be united by the hands of men. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life looked at each other. No words were needed. Each knew that their destiny was now being sealed. They raised their arms and, at the same time, placed their palms on the surface of the two relics. A wave of energy passed through them, tearing their bodies and souls, but reuniting them in a new form. They felt themselves divided in two. On one side, memory, the weight of the past, giants and stones. On the other side, light, living thoughts, and the ethereal dance of the Elyrians. And yet, the two currents did not destroy each other, but united in a common river. His visions they flooded. They saw human cities burning in wars. They saw generations that would rise and fall. They saw dangers, but also possibilities for harmony. They saw how the earth, although wounded, could be reborn. The Witness of Life, with a trembling voice, whispered to the Bridge of Light, "You are not alone, I am here. Your oath is mine too." The Gorduy crystal emitted a deep, deep tone, like an echo of the mountains. At the same time, the Elyrian sphere burst into a pure, white light, blinding and yet gentle. It was confirmation that the oath had been received. Thamros raised his hands, and his voice resounded solemnly. Today, in front of the memory of Gorduy and the Elyrian light, the Bridge of Light becomes Eryon-Tal. The link between the worlds is the one who translates, protects, and carries our word to humanity. Sael-Rien continued, touching lightly on the forehead of the Witness of Life. "And you, Sael-Rien, Witness of Life, are the balance between heart and word. Without you, his oath would be fragile. You are the anchor, you are the proof that love is stronger than fear." A circle of white and blue light formed around the two, rising like a column that pierced the ceiling and was lost in the constellations above. The light penetrated their bodies, rewriting their being. From now on, they were no longer just people. They carried within them the memory of one civilization and the heart of another. After the ceremony, they were left alone on the terrace of the crystal tower. Eryon-Tal pulsed gently beside them, like a sleeping mountain, and Elyr shone quietly, like a small sun that breathed with the universe. The Witness of Life placed his head on the shoulder of the Bridge of Light and whispered, "I swore. And now the oath is no longer just theirs, T is ours too." The bridge smiled, looking at the vertical oceans that reflected the stars. Then we will never be alone. Even if war comes, we will be the bridge and the witness, until the end. And so, the oath on Elyan was sealed, not just a promise between civilizations, but the bond between two people who had become the symbol of a fragile hope. But what they did not yet know was that on Earth, their oath had already been interpreted as an act of betrayal. And that the first step towards a 100-year war had already been taken. Chapter 4. The First Bloodshed. In the tense silence of the world, the peace was broken forever. The Earth, once just a home for humanity, had transformed into a giant chessboard, where the pieces were lives and destinies. The Gorduy, giants from the depths of the stars, had descended to Earth with the nobility of world builders, bearers of 𝕿𝖃, the stone of memory. The Elyrians, beings of light, had joined them, bringing the gift of 𝕿𝖃, the heart of knowledge. Together, they had desired peace. But the people, overwhelmed by fear and suspicion, saw in them conquerors, not brothers. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life, the two earthlings raised on Elyan to speak the oath of defense, had tried to quell the flames of conflict. Their voices had resounded among the leaders' planet, but the echo was lost in the noise of the weapons being prepared. Their oath, sacred to the Gorduy and Elyrian civilizations, had been for humans only a sign of betrayal. And so, the inevitable happened. In the desert on the edge of the Nile, where the pyramids rose as eternal witnesses of time, the first spark appeared. The Gorduy had descended to protect the sacred places, ancient sanctuaries that their own colossal hands had erected millennia ago. They were temples of energy, nodes through which the breath of the planet flowed. But for humans, the presence of these giants among the pyramids seemed like a hostile claim. The Earth generals ordered mobilization. The Egyptian army, supported by international forces, had surrounded the place with tanks and planes, believing that the invasion was beginning from there. The soldiers trembled behind their weapons, for they had seen with their own eyes how the Gorduy, as tall as the towers of the cities, walked without fear, and the earth trembled under their weight. "If we let them take over these monuments, tomorrow they will demand the whole world," a general had shouted in a global broadcast. Televisions and networks flashed with images of these beings, presented as monsters come to conquer. But Gorduy had not raised their weapons. They did not know war in the bloody form of men. Their power was beyond metal and gunpowder. They rested their huge palms on the stones of the pyramids, murmuring words in a language that seemed a song of the earth itself. Glimpses of light rose from the tops of the monuments, a sign that the energy was awakened. The Elyrians, invisible to the untrained eye, mingled among the people, trying to calm their minds. They sent out subtle waves of peace, an influence meant to calm angry hearts. But fear was stronger than their comfort, and each man vibrated the ancient fear of the unknown, and fear gave birth to hatred. The first bullet came from a human weapon. A soldier, young and terrified, had seen the silhouette of a Gorduy approaching. Thinking that the monster would crush them, he pulled the trigger. The bullet ricocheted powerlessly off the giant's stone-thick skin, but the sound of the shot turned into an explosion of panic. Like an echo, machine gun bursts erupted, planes descended, tanks fired. The hiss of projectiles filled the air. The Gorduy rose, not with anger, but with sadness. The stone of memory, 𝕿𝖃, vibrated in their hands. Like a wounded heart point, one of the giants fell to his knees, not from the blow, but from the pain that the people they had returned for looked at them as tyrants. He raised his palm and stopped a shower of missiles, pulverizing them into the air, but not sending back any attacks. Yet the earth itself trembled with every step they took. And then, inevitably, the first human blood was shed. A wave of energy released by a Gorduy scattered the armor, and dozens of soldiers died crushed under the metal shells. The images circled the planet. The screens broadcast the bodies of soldiers falling, planes crashing, cries of horror. No one had ever seen such power, and no message of peace could be heard. World leaders declared, "This is the beginning of the invasion. Humanity must fight to survive." Thus, fear turned into collective hatred. The United States, Russia, China, Europe, every nation threw its armies into battle. The planetary mobilization had begun on the planet Elyan. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life felt the call. Their connection with 𝕿𝖃 and 𝕿𝖃 brought them terrible visions, burning cities, crying children, fallen giants, beings of light scattered like sparks. "This was not meant to happen," whispered the Witness of Life, her tears flowing like springs under the gaze of the Elyrians. "Our oath is now tested," answered the Bridge of Light. "If humanity cannot understand, then we must be the bridge between the worlds." With 𝕿𝖃 shining in his hand and 𝕿𝖃 pulsing like a living heart in hers, they descended back to Earth, into the middle of the battlefield. They stepped among the shattered tanks, among the bodies of soldiers, and shouted for the fight to stop. The Bridge of Light lifted 𝕿𝖃 up, and the light of the stone covered the sky like an aurora. The witness of life spoke words of healing, and the wounded they stood up, the blood stopping, the pains easing. For a moment, everything stopped. The soldiers and the giants looked at each other through an abyss of misunderstanding. Peace seemed possible, but the fear of the people was stronger than the miracle. Another general ordered the attack. The planes descended, launching missiles at the giants and even at the two earthlings. Explosions covered the sky, and the earth trembled. The first blood had been shed. The first step towards 100-year war had been taken. After that day, the world was never the same. The blood of the soldiers and the energy of Gorduy had mixed, and the earth absorbed the fury of the two camps. The Elyrians, trying to appease, had been rejected as mind manipulators. The Gorduy, despite their oath not to bring destruction, were forced to respond in order to survive. Humanity saw only the monster, not the benefactor, and the monster, once born in the hearts of people, could no longer be banished. This first, the bloody chapter, marks the transition. From hope to conflict, from peace to hatred. Despite the oath, despite the gifts of Eryon-Tal and Elyrians, humanity chose the sword over dialogue. The first bloodshed became the seal of an age of darkness, which would last a century. Chapter 5. The Illusion of Power. After the shedding of first blood, humanity plunged into a fever of preparations. Fear, transformed into anger, became fuel for the most intense period of research and militarization the world had ever known, and hidden laboratories, underground or in the depths of the oceans, scientists and military worked together for a single purpose: to bring down the Gorduy giants and resist the hypnotic mind of the Elyrians. Politicians everywhere proclaimed, "We are not victims, we are masters of the earth. Our weapons will save us, and being is stronger than man when pushed to the edge of the abyss." But what was born was not true power, but the illusion of power. The states of the world began a mad race, and the United States, the Titan Project, was formed, in Russia the Iron Shadow, in China the Black Dragon, and in Europe the Shield of the Gods. Each the laboratory was a fortress where people tried to understand how to face what could not be reached by conventional weapons. Against Gorduy, researchers tried to create weapons capable of piercing their skin as hard as granite. Conventional bombardments had only managed to wound them superficially. Thus, sonic cannons appeared, devices that emitted waves capable of disintegrating stone molecules. Against the Elyrians, governments knew that their mental influence was unstoppable. People bowed, hypnotized, without knowing to resist. Neural helmets and implants were built to block the subtle waves of the beings of light. They were called the Mind Wall. Humanity was walking on an unknown path, and each invention was greeted with applause and fear. The first tests on the battlefields were a mixture of triumph and horror. In the Sahara, a Gorduy was attacked with sonic cannons. The stone colossi, usually unmovable, felt the vibrations penetrating their dense flesh. One of them fell to his knees, letting out a roar that shook the desert. The human army jubilated, "We can hurt them." But the giant was not dead. He stood up, his eyes burning with pain and disappointment, and a single gesture of his hand stirred up a sandstorm that swallowed hundreds of soldiers. Victory and defeat, mixed in the same red desert, and in Asia, soldiers equipped with the Mind Wall encountered Elyrians for the first time on the battlefield, while their unprotected colleagues bowed, captive under the spell of light. Those with neural helmets remained unmoved. They seemed invincible, like warriors immune to the shining gods, but they soon discovered the side effect. The helmet blocked not only the Elyrians' waves, but also empathy, pure thoughts, and over time, the soldiers became cold, inhuman, almost killing machines, and the capitals of the world, generals and political leaders rubbed their hands with satisfaction. They already considered themselves victorious. Gorduy can bleed. The Elyrians can no longer control us. The power is ours. The press, controlled by propaganda, broadcast images of wounded giants and soldiers resisting the light. People began to believe that the war could be won, that the future belonged only to them. But no one understood the truth. What they were hurting was not the body of civilizations, but only their patience. And the patience of the gods has limits. The two defenders, bound by Eryon-Tal and Elyrians, watched in horror as the world slid into madness. The Bridge of Light, carrying the memory stone of Gorduy, felt the pain of the giants, the echo of millions of generations struck by weapons of men. We cannot let this continue. They will not understand until they self-destruct. The witness of life, held by Elyrians, heard in his mind the cries of the Elyrians, their light broken by the walls of the mind. People are killing themselves. They cut off their souls to escape the influence of light. They think they are freeing themselves, but they become slaves to their own coldness. Together, they tried again to be the bridge between the worlds. But every day, their voices were drowned out by the sound of weapons and their rush to victory. People went even further. Their projects reached the forbidden border between science and madness. Metal giants, huge machines, inspired by Gorduy's stature, capable of rising above cities. They were controlled by pilots connected directly to their circuits, through brain implants, kind of giant men, but made of iron. Shadow bombs, created to absorb and disperse light energy, special weapons against the Elyrians. When they exploded, they left behind dark areas, where no spark could penetrate. These inventions were hailed as miracles of survival, but the truth was more sinister. The Earth itself was beginning to crumble under the weight of these unnatural energies, and the 10th year of the war, humans tested all their new weapons in a huge battle on the plains of Mesopotamia. The Gorduy had come to protect the sacred ruins of Ur, and the Elyrians watched over them. The armies of humanity entered into battle with the metal giants and the walls of mind. Sonic cannons roared, and shadow bombs covered the sky. For the first time, the Gorduy giants faltered, and the Elyrians vanished like flames extinguished by the wind. The generals proclaimed victory. "We have defeated them. Our power is absolute." But the Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life felt what others could not. It had not been a victory, but a challenge. That night, when the people rejoiced, when the drunkenness and songs echoed in the camps, Gorduy and the Elyrians watched in silence. They were not afraid of weapons. They could not be defeated by metal and shadows alone. But their pain grew, and their patience ran out. And when patience ran out, the gods' response was not war, but catastrophe. Humanity, blinded by its own technology, did not understand that their power was only an illusion. Weapons were but a fragile shield against an endless ocean. And when the ocean rose, no wall, no machine, no implant would be able to save them. Thus, the beginning of the century of war was marked by the arrogance of men. They believed that they could face the giants and the light. They believed that their weapons could rewrite the order of the universe. But in reality, they had only scratched the scars of the cosmos and sowed the seeds of an even darker future. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life knew the truth. The real fight was just beginning, and the hardest battle was not between men and stellar civilizations, but between man and his own illusion of power. Chapter 6. The Fall of the Great Cities. The illusion of human power was short-lived. After the apparent victory in Mesopotamia, the generals and leaders of the world returned to their capitals with heads held high and promises of glory. The press roared, the people cheered, and military parades swept the streets of New York, Moscow, Beijing, London, and Paris. The beginning of the era of the liberated man was proclaimed. But beyond the festivities, shadows gathered. The Gorduy, patient and calm until then, watched with bitterness. They, builders of the pyramids, witnesses to the rise of humanity, could no longer bear to see their heritage used against the light. Strange echoes vibrated in Eryon-Tal, the warnings of previous generations. When man rises against those who built him, his walls will collapse. The Bridge of Light, sensing through the sacred stone the restlessness of the giants, tried to stop them. The Witness of Life implored the Elyrians to intervene, to calm the wave of anger. But it was too late. The first punishment was about to come. On a night when the moon seemed to float like a wound in the sky, the Gorduy giants descended. Not with ships, not with firearms, but with their heavy tectonic steps, which shook the earth with every movement. They were colossuses of stone and flesh, with eyes shining like lava and skin shining under the starlight. New York. The first to fall was New York. The skyscrapers that had risen as symbols of human pride were torn apart like frail sticks. The Gorduy used no artificial weapons. Their arms were natural catapults, and their feet were living earthquakes. The Empire State Building collapsed like a sandcastle, and the Brooklyn Bridge snapped in two under the weight of a giant who stepped over it like a dry leaf. Sirens wailed. Helicopters raised missiles into the air, but all was in vain. In less than 3 hours, the metropolis that never slept was reduced to a pile of ash and smoke. Moscow. In Moscow, the Kremlin became the main target. Giants marched across Red Square as if across a deserted field. The gilded domes of cathedrals melted under their incandescent palms. The tanks and rockets launched by the Russian army proved powerless. The shells ricocheted like stones thrown from a mountain, and in just a few days, the capital of the empire had been transformed into a historical disgrace, and the red, white, and blue flag burned before the eyes of millions of refugees. Beijing. In Beijing, the Chinese people saw the walls of their history crumble. The Great Wall, once an unshakable barrier, was broken like a dry riverbed under the steps of the giants. The Forbidden Palace was reduced to a smoking ruin, and the capital's sky darkened under black clouds and ash. Millions of souls fled in panic, but there were not enough roads to escape the Colossus. London and Paris. Europe suffered the same fate. London was swallowed by the waters when the Gorduy struck the Thames and caused the river to overflow the city. The Tower of London and Big Ben were swallowed by the waves, and Paris, the giants trampled the Champs-Élysées, and the Eiffel Tower collapsed like a broken spear, while the Louvre was shattered, as if art and culture had no value in the face of their fury. The scenes transmitted by surveillance cameras and the few TV stations that still worked showed an apocalyptic reality. The entire earth was witnessing the fall of its own pride. Millions of people were fleeing the streets, praying to a god they had forgotten in their rush for weapons. The generals, until then sure of their victories, were gathering in bunkers and looking for solutions. But for every strategy, the giants had a simple answer: a step, a blow, a tectonic roar. No one could stop their march.In the midst of the disaster, the Bridge of Light descended among the people, trying to gather them, calm them, explain to them. But the people looked at him as a traitor. "You brought them upon us. You are the bridge to death," they shouted, throwing stones and curses. The Witness of Life wept silently, feeling in 𝕼𝖭 the vibrations of human pain. The beings of light still tried to temper the giants' anger, but the Gorduy were unstoppable. It was their right, they said, to cleanse the earth of human pride. The destruction of the capitals was not just an act of war. The Gorduy wanted to convey a message. Nothing that humanity had built was eternal. Their pyramids, their walls, their temples were still standing after millennia, but the skyscrapers and bridges of modern humanity fell in a few moments. Eryon-Tal. The Bridge of Light heard the whispers of the giant civilization. "We will let them understand. We will show them that their pride is vain. And if they do not understand, then we will move on." But the people did not understand. Instead of bowing their heads, they began to build even more weapons. From the ruins of the cities, the war industry rose even stronger. After the fall of the great cities, the planet entered an era of chaos. Governments collapsed. The global economy disappeared. Millions of refugees, they roamed the plains in search of food and water. Some began to worship the Gorduy as vengeful gods. Others hated them with a blind hatred, swearing to fight to the last man. Humanity was divided into two camps, those who demanded peace and submission and those who cried out for revenge. The Witness of Life tried to gather the survivors, to teach them to preserve their humanity. But the whole world seemed blinded by blood and fire. The destruction of the great cities was the moment when humanity understood that the victory in Mesopotamia had been an illusion. No mental wall, no shadow bomb, no metal giant could stop the wrath of the giants. And yet, instead of stopping, people began to dream of even more weapons. If we have lost the cities, let's build others underground. If the giants tread on the ground, let's strike them from the sky. If the light blinds us, let's invent even deeper shadows. Thus began the new phase of the war, a competition of total destruction. The fall of the great cities marked the first great catastrophe of the 100 Years' War. It was the moment when humanity saw how fragile it was in the face of the civilizations that had shaped its past. And yet, the lesson was not understood. Instead of seeking peace, people deepened and more in the illusion of power. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life watched as the world burned, knowing that the road to peace was still far and that the price would be unimaginable. Chapter 7. The Armies of Light. After the Gorduy giants destroyed the capitals of humanity, leaving behind heaps of ruins and millions of lost souls, the balance of the world seemed lost forever. Darkness, fear, and a thirst for revenge ruled the hearts of people, and the wrath of the giants seemed unstoppable. But in the space between the stars, another force, more subtle and ancient, watched everything with unclosed eyes: the Elyrians, the army of light. They were not giants of stone and flesh like the Gorduy, nor warriors in heavy armor, nor builders of weapons. They were beings of pure energy, essences of thought, harmony, and cosmic vibration. For them, the sword was the word, and the shield was the light. They did not come to conquer, but to stop the spiral of self-destruction. The dawn of a battle on the plains of Central Asia, where the survivors had gathered to battles against the giants, the sky turned into a cloth of gold and silver. There was no smoke, no fire, but a dense, palpable light, like a shining fog. From it began to emerge boundless silhouettes, translucent forms that seemed to float. The armies of humanity, with their tanks, missiles, and new weapons developed in secret, stopped for a few moments, believing that they were witnessing a new threat. But from those ethereal figures came no sound of war, but only an overwhelming silence, a wave of calm that spread like a tide. The soldiers felt their hands tremble, their weapons seem heavy, almost impossible to lift. Many let their rifles fall into the dust, watching with wide eyes. The Elyrians did not attack. They did not know the brutal blow, but the vibration of the mind. They entered the field of consciousness of the opposing army and broke their will to kill. In an instant, generals forgot their strategies, soldiers forgot their hatred, and bloodlust disappeared like a mist dispersed by the sun. A shocking example occurred on the border between Europe and Asia, where a human army was preparing to launch thousands of missiles at the giant Gorduy. The Elyrians descended like a sea of light and, with a single common thought, stopped all the fingers of the soldiers who were about to press the buttons. Thousands of hands stopped in the air, unable to continue. A deep silence fell over the camp, and tears began to flow down the cheeks of the people, without them knowing It was not magic, but a higher reality. The collective thought of the Elyrians settled over the minds of the people and dissolved hatred, revenge, fear. But the Gorduy, the stone giants, looked with contempt on this intervention. Weaknesses of shadows and thoughts, they shouted, raising their feet to crush the fields where the survivors had gathered. Then the Elyrians rose up before them, not with weapons, but with vibrations of light. Each step of a Gorduy was met by a wave of thought that slowed him down, unbalanced him, made him lose his orientation. Some giants, angry, began to strike the air, but they discovered that they could not hurt beings who had no bodies. One giant collapsed on the field. not because he had been struck, but because his mind had been invaded by a torrent of memories, ancient times, when Gorduy and the Elyrians had cooperated in raising the first temples on Earth. Seeing those images, the giant cried and refused to fight any more. For humans, the encounter with the Elyrians was both a miracle and a terror. Many wondered. We controls? Steals our will. But others felt true peace for the first time, and in the ruins of Paris, a group of refugees stood up and walked fearlessly through the middle of the battlefield. Around them, the Elyrians weaved invisible shields, and the Gorduy soldiers refused to strike them. It was as if the innocence of the children and the purity of the women who accompanied them were multiplied and spread by the beings of light, stopping any attack in Africa, where war threatened to turn the savannas into fields of fire. The Elyrians descended like showers of stars. The tribes that were preparing to fight for food and water stopped, because their hunger was transformed, for a few moments, into song and hope. The generals, however, were the hardest to convince. They saw in the Elyrians an obstacle to revenge. "If you take our weapons, you condemn us," they shouted. Then the Elyrians chose to show themselves. One of them, named 𝕾𝖆𝖗, the bearer of harmony, materialized in the form of a man of light before a military council hidden in a bunker in Germany. In a gentle but firm voice, he said, "Your weapons are not shields, but chains. War does not bring you freedom, but death. We do not take away your will, we show you the mirror. If you do not like what you see, change, do not destroy." 𝕾𝖆𝖗's words shook the hall. Some began to believe. Others continued to plot secretly against them, trying to find ways to counter the invasion of light. Across the globe, the Elyrians began to intervene where the fighting was the bloodiest, and the Middle East, where people were throwing bombs at each other even in the ruins of already destroyed, the Elyrians transformed the explosions into harmless clouds of light. In South America, where gangs of refugees were slaughtering each other for territory, the Elyrians spread a vibration that brought back common memories, causing them to recognize their brothers and lay down their weapons. It was an army without weapons, but more effective than any military force on Earth. The Gorduy giants began to fear. They, who believed in the power of the fist and the strength of stone, now discovered that thought was stronger than stone. Many refused to continue the destruction, but their leaders, the oldest and most stubborn, swore to destroy the Elyrians. Thus, a new stage of the war was taking shape, not between humans and giants, but between stone and light, between brutality and harmony. For humans, the Elyrians' intervention was a chance and a challenge. Those who followed them felt hope reborn in their hearts. Those who rejected them saw in them invisible tyrants who stole their freedom to choose even evil. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life understood then that their role was to become mediators. They could not choose for the giants, nor for the Elyrians, nor for the humans, but they had to show the way. Thus began the era of the armies of light, when entire battles were stopped without a single drop of blood, by the simple vibration of thought. Humanity discovered for the first time what it means to be disarmed not by force, but by conscience. But deep down, many people still did not give up the desire for revenge. The illusion of power had not died, and the Gorduy, with their wounded pride, were preparing to respond with even greater violence. The world was now between two extremes, the light that wanted to stop everything and the stone that wanted to crush everything. And man had to choose, to be the bridge or the abyss. Chapter 8. The Betrayal of the Generals. The peace brought by the Elyrians through the power of thought seemed, to many, a blessing. Entire battles had ended bloodlessly, and people had discovered for the first time that violence could be stopped by a simple wave of light. But in the most hidden corners of the world, where power was built on fear and control, some people saw things differently. The generals, the political and military leaders of the nations, who had erected their thrones on mountains of corpses and weapons, felt that the ground was being torn from under their feet. For them, the Elyrians were not messengers of peace, but subtle invaders, who took their most precious asset, absolute authority over the people. The fear of losing power quickly turned into hatred, and hatred became a bridge to betrayal and the underground of a destroyed metropolis in Europe, in a bunker where sunlight had not reached for years in the middle of the night. The world's greatest generals gathered. Their uniforms were torn, their faces scarred, but their eyes shone with the same thirst for domination. It is said that there were 21 commanders at that meeting, each representing an armed faction still faithful to the old ways of fighting. On the table were not only maps, but also relics of the past: nuclear launch keys, devices for biological weapons, prototypes of machines capable of withstanding even the giants of Gorduy. The oldest general, known as 𝕝rek of the North, spoke first. "The Elyrians disarmed us without firing a shot, and what next? Will they chain our minds, make us slaves to their thoughts? I do not submit to shadows who smile and say they want peace." "But how to fight them?" asked another general. "Weapons cannot touch them. Their minds penetrate us and break our will, and no matter how hard we try, they are invincible." 𝕝rek smiled bitterly and took out of a sealed box a black stone, pulsing with a dark light. "I received this gift from the depths of the earth, not from the Elyrians, not from the Gorduy, but from those whom even the gods do not mention, the 𝕝dr. The 𝕝dr were neither Gorduy nor Elyrians. They were something else, older, deeper rooted in the womb of the world. Beings born from the despair of people and nourished by the blood spilled for millennia. Legend said that they were the first to whisper to people about fire, metal and weapons, not for progress, but for destruction. The generals found them in the catacombs of abandoned cities, under ancient temples, in the ruins burned by time. They were clear, disembodied figures, made of smoke and darkness, which did not demand worship, but only the spread of chaos. "If you will serve us," the 𝕝drs said in a chorus of cold voices, "we will offer you the weapons of reverse thought. Just as the Elyrians can bring peace, you can bring madness. Where they stop wars, you will ignite others, and then the world will remain yours." The generals did not hesitate. They clapped their hands with the darkness. With the help of the 𝕝drs, people began to develop new technologies, combined with unknown energies. They were weapons that did not strike the body, but the mind, noise. Fields that shattered the vibrations of the Elyrians, devices that spread collective hallucinations, projectiles that left clouds of despair in their wake. Thus were born the dark weapons, the first capable of resisting the power of thought and hidden laboratories. Prisoners were used as experiments. Exposed to dark radiation, many lost their minds, but a few survived, transforming into soldiers insensitive to the Elyrian vibrations. They were called the 𝕝dori army, a new human army prepared to defy the light. It was not long before the first troops of 𝕝dori were thrown into battle. The Elyrians, accustomed to stopping battles with their mere thought, were surprised. The waves of peace did not penetrate the minds of these soldiers. They continued to shoot, to kill, to burn everything in their path. The light bridge and the witness of life watched in horror at these changes. They knew that the war had changed again, and the fragile hope of peace was crumbling. The two walked ahead of the generals, trying to stop them. "What you are doing is suicide," said the light bridge, lifting Eryon-Tal. "The shadows do not give you strength. They dig into your soul. One day, you will find that you yourselves have become their slaves." But the generals laughed. "Better slaves to the 𝕝dr than subjects of the light. Better masters of our fear than prisoners of your false peace." The witness of life wept, feeling the fate of humanity sinking deeper into the abyss. In Asia, the Elyrians had managed to stop a huge battle between the human armies and the Gorduy. But when their lights descended to bring peace, the traitorous generals unleashed the dark weapons. Fields of mental noise jammed the Elyrians' vibrations. For the first time, the beings of light were shaken, some disappearing like extinguished sparks. The 𝕝dr advanced, blowing up refugee camps and shouting that the freedom of the people had been regained. But it was not freedom. It was only the beginning of a new slavery, the slavery of darkness. The Gorduy giants watched this scene with amazement. They, who until then had despised the Elyrians for their weakness, began to feel a shiver of fear. "People have learned to defeat light," they murmured. "And what will happen if one day they learn to defeat stone too?" Thus, the Gorduy began to prepare a new offensive, fearing not only the Elyrians, but also the humans who, corrupted by the 𝕝dorians, had become more dangerous than ever. And the pale light of a sunrise over the ruins of Europe, the generals looked at the battlefields where the Elyrians were retreating for the first time. They felt victorious, convinced that they had defeated their greatest threat. But behind them, the 𝕝dorians laughed silently. Their laughter was neither human nor divine. It was the laughter of an insatiable hunger that knew that, step by step, humans were selling their souls for a power they would never control again. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life knew the truth. It was not the Elyrians, nor the Gorduy, who were now the greatest danger, but the very humans who had betrayed the light for the illusion of domination. And so, the war that it seemed near the end, it sank into a new hell, with the betrayal of the generals as the spark of an even more terrible conflagration. Chapter 9. The Bridge of Light in the Midst of Fire. The earth was burning. Each continent was an open wound, each city a bleeding scar on the body of a planet struggling between death and rebirth. From the north came reports of cities destroyed by the fist of the giant Gorduy, who no longer distinguished between soldiers and civilians. From the south, words carried whispers of entire battalions paralyzed by the Elyrians, remaining prisoners in their own minds. The war had reached a point where peace seemed a distant memory, and men, fierce and gripped by fear, sought to find the guilty in every dark corner. In the midst of this chaos, Eryon-Tal, the Bridge of Light, was caught between two worlds. On Elyan, he had sworn a sacred oath, to defend Gorduy and the Elyrians with his own life. But his heart was still bound to earth, to the families and nations that now regarded him as a stranger, as a traitor who had sold humanity into the hands of the gods descended from the stars. On a gray morning, as the sky of Europe turned the ominous red of fires, the Bridge of Light walked through the ruins of a fallen capital. Once tall buildings had collapsed beneath the feet of the Gorduy giants. The streets were filled with ash and people who looked at him with fear and hatred. Some threw stones at him, others were shielding their children, muttering prayers against the bearer of the heavenly curse. Eryon-Tal raised his hands, trying to speak to them, to tell them that he had come to stop the massacre. But no words could penetrate their hearts. Them, he was nothing more than the messenger of invincible enemies. In a valley in the east, where the fronts clashed with the fury of tens of thousands of souls, the Bridge of Light tried to do the impossible, to place itself between humans and Gorduy. The earthly armies, armed with new weapons, were preparing for a desperate attack. The Gorduy giants, tall as towers, raised their arms ready to crush the earth itself. Eryon-Tal stepped into their midst, shouting, "Stop! There is no more room for blood." But the answer was a bullet. A human soldier, blinded by hatred and fear, fired at him without hesitation. The bullet did not kill him. Eryon-Tal protected his body, but the wound was deep enough to bring him to his knees. The Gorduy giants interpreted the gesture as a direct act of war. With a guttural cry, they charged forward, striking with fury. The earth shook. The human army was shattered in a matter of moments, and in the midst of this carnage, the Lightbringer rose again, blood streaming down his shoulder, and shouted, "That is not why I came. Not for destruction." But no one listened to him anymore. The news spread quickly. The Bridge of Light defends the giants. Clandestine newspapers, secret communication channels, generals who wanted to maintain control, all used his image as a symbol of betrayal. In the eyes of the masses, he was no longer a defender, but one who raised his shield in the face of enemies. "One of us chose to be on their side," He sold his soul for their powers. He is no longer human. Eryon-Tal read these words engraved on burnt pamphlets, heard them spoken in public squares where people cursed his name. And yet, he did not stop going with the battles with the fiercest, trying to stand between sword and flesh, between giant and man. Each time he was pushed, struck, driven. But he did not give in. For the oath sworn on Elyan was stronger than fear, heavier than hatred, and a village near the borders of Africa, the Elyan armies used the power of the mind to stop a human assault. The earth. Soldiers, caught in the nets of thought, turned against their own brothers, fighting like puppets. Their cries mingled with the tears of women and children caught in the middle. There, the bridge of light entered the circle of mind created by the Elyans. He felt his every thought being dissected, his memories being turned upside down. But with the power of Eryon-Tal, he managed to break the connection between the human mind and the Elyrians' rays. The soldiers collapsed to the ground, exhausted and stunned, and a few civilians managed to escape. But to those watching from the hills, the scene had another meaning. The bridge of light raised its hand, and the soldiers fell. People believed that he himself controlled their minds. Thus, the legend of his betrayal gained even more power, and in the midst of this chaos, Sael-Rien, the witness of life, came to him. He had found him in the ruins, amidst the corpses and smoke. She carried the burden of Elyrians on her shoulders, and her face was furrowed with the pain of having seen so many destinies cut short. Eryon-Tal, she told him, her voice trembling, we cannot stop this fire alone. They no longer see us as human, them, we are long dead. Then let us die among them, trying to save what is left, he answered. Even if everyone sees us as monsters. The witness of life looked at him with tearful eyes. She loved and hated him at the same time, for his courage and stubbornness, for his desire to remain the bridge between the worlds. As the months passed, the image of Eryon-Tal became darker in the eyes of the people. He was hunted, pursued by his own armies. The generals wanted him captured, some even executed. But the Gorduy giants considered him a brother of memory, and the Elyrians a shield of light. One night, in the middle of a battlefield lit by explosions, Eryon-Tal knelt among the fallen bodies, raised Eryon-Tal above his head, and shouted to the sky, "If this is the price to be the bridge between the worlds, then I accept. Let the hatred burn upon me, but save this planet." The sky responded with a blinding flash of lightning, and for a moment all weapons fell silent. But the silence was only an illusion. People raised their weapons again, and the war continued. Thus, the bridge of light remained caught in the middle of the fire. He tried to extinguish the flames, but whenever he raised his hand, people saw him as the one who maintained them. He was a witness to the collapse of cities, the destruction of the civilization that had given birth to him, and at the same time, a protector of those who came from the stars. He was the bridge, but the bridge had turned into a battlefield. And no matter how much he tried to save lives, history was already writing him as a traitor. Chapter 10. The Witness of Life and the Tears of Healing. While the flames of war consumed the continents, amidst the ruins and pain, a voice rose that neither bullets, nor the power of the mind, nor the fury of the Gorduy giants could silence. It was the voice of the witness of life, Sael-Rien, who carried in her heart the vibration of Elyrians, the heart of Elyrian knowledge. If the bridge of light was doomed to be seen as a traitor, she, paradoxically, became a ray of hope in the darkness, and a village on the plains of Central Asia. People were fleeing the war. Old people and children, women and the wounded, all crowded within the crumbling walls of an ancient fortress. Diseases were spreading, and hunger was biting into their weakened bodies. One night, when the wind brought the smell of smoke and burning flesh, Sael-Rien descended among them. Her eyes shone with a gentleness almost impossible in a world torn by hatred. When she saw a wounded child, his leg torn off by an explosion, she bent down and, holding him in her arms, began to cry. Her tears were not simple human tears. They were sparks of pure light, drops that carried the echo of Elyrians' knowledge. When they fell on the child's wound, the skin gradually closed, and his pain disappeared. The people were stunned. For the first time after months of suffering, they saw a miracle that did not destroy, but healed. The next day, the village elders came to her, asking her to ease their pain. Sael-Rien passed among them, touching them the wounded, whispering words of comfort. The sick began to breathe easier, and those who had lost hope felt a new strength in their hearts. Thus was born the legend of the Tears of Healing. From that moment on, the witness of life was no longer just a being from the stars. For many, she had become a symbol of salvation. Rumors spread from village to village, the woman who cries and raises the dead from the bed of pain. The goddess who touches and hunger disappears. The witness who brings peace where the earth shakes with hatred. First, people came out of curiosity. Then, they came out of desperation. Mothers with sick babies, soldiers with their bodies burned by Gorduy's weapons, hungry and weakened villagers, all sought her out. And she did not refuse anyone. But, along with them, those who saw in her a weapon also appeared. The generals they followed, convinced that her gift could be used to rebuild armies, to keep soldiers alive who would otherwise have died. But Sael-Rien did not heal for war. She healed only those who bore no weapons, the innocent. When a general brought an entire unit of wounded soldiers to her camp, she refused. "I do not give power to the sword. I give hope to life." That choice divided the world even more. The common people, she was a saint. The leaders, she was as great a threat as the Elyrians and Gorduy. One night, in the ruins of a library consumed by flames, the witness of life stood before the crowd gathered around her. She knew that people needed not only healing of the body, but also healing of the soul. The war has made us shadows. We have forgotten each other as brothers and have only seen each other as enemies. But I tell you, every life you spare is a greater victory than any city conquered. People listened in silence, and some began to cry. She did not ask them to rise to the fight, nor to choose a side. She only asked them to remain human, even in the midst of hell. With every word, the witness of life gathered around her not only survivors, but also believers. Her followers began to accompany her from place to place, carrying her message, distributing pieces of bread, caring for the wounded, sheltering orphans. Thus was born what would later be called the Brotherhood of Tears. Eryon-Tal, the Bridge of Light, had heard the rumors. Wounded, marginalized, blamed by all, he came to look for her. When he found her, amidst the crowd of people gathered, he felt for the first time in a long time that there was still a ray of hope. "Sael-Rien," he told her, "you teach them to live when everyone wants to die. I stop them by force, and I am called a traitor. You cry, and they call you a savior. Perhaps you are the real bridge, not me." She touched his face with her delicate hands and answered, "There is no bridge without pillars on both sides. You are the pillar that stops the collapse. I am only the water that flows underneath, reminding them that life goes on. Together, we can hold this world in balance." Under the guidance of the witness of life, entire villages refused to take up arms. They built shelters, cultivated the land in the midst of war. There, the Gorduy giants passed without striking, and the Elyrians stopped their influence. It was as if her tears transformed the surrounding space into a sanctuary. But these communities immediately became targets for the people who saw in them pockets of treason. The general sent troops to destroy them, considering them collaborators with the stellar civilizations. Then, Sael-Rien stood up again before the sword, and each time she chose to cry. Her tears disarmed some soldiers, who threw down their weapons and refused to fight. Others, however, saw her as a dangerous witch. What no one understood was that the gift of the witness of life was not only to heal bodies. Her tears had the power to dispel the shadows of fear from souls. People who listened to her began to dream again, to believe that the world could exist beyond the fire. An old man who had lost his entire family told her, "I thought I had nothing left to live for. But when I saw your tears, I remembered that I could still plant seeds. And if a flower sprouts, then it is worth staying." These confessions were her true power. Not weapons, not strategies, but the rebirth of a fragile hope. Thus, amidst the ruins of a torn planet, the witness of life began to write another story. T was not the story of the sword, nor of the power of the mind, nor of giants. T was the story of tears that heal, of small communities that refuse hatred, of simple people who choose life over death. Her first followers became the seeds of a current of peaceful resistance, a current that would grow over time, defying the logic of war. And so, even though armies were still torn apart, even though cities were still burning, in the hearts of those who had followed her, a certainty sprouted, that life can be reborn even from the blackest ashes. Chapter 11. The Iron Age. It is said that the history of mankind is a succession of eras marked by discoveries, beliefs, revolutions, and rebirths. But the war that broke out between Earth and the two stellar civilizations would end any dream of progress. Instead of rebirths, people entered a slow but steady collapse, which pushed them into an era without color, without poetry, with no other meaning than survival through weapons. Historians, the few who still kept manuscripts hidden in cellars and crypts, called that period the Iron Age. And the first decades after the descent of Gorduy and the Elyrians, people still hoped to defend their cities, protect their cultures, and continue their existence despite the chaos. But as the war deepened, every institution that once gave meaning to civilization began to crumble. Libraries were burned, universities were closed or transformed into military training centers, temples and churches became fortresses or weapons depots. Poetry, music, and art were declared useless, even dangerous, because they weakened discipline. Everything that could bring the memory of a peaceful life was removed. Thus, man redefined himself not by what he created, but by what he destroyed. The factories of the earth were transformed into colossus of weapons production. Each continent built its forged cities, industrial metropolises where no one lived, but only worked. Huge foundries, steel halls, assembly lines where men, women, and children toiled to create weapons designed to strike either the giants of Gorduy or the Elyrians of light. The most brilliant scientists were torn from their laboratories and forced to work for the military leaders. Weapons of new generation, projectiles capable of breaking Gorduy's skin, mind-jamming technologies designed to resist the influence of the Elyrians, exoskeletons for soldiers, and mobile tanks powered by resources ripped off at the cost of devastating ecosystems. Each innovation was not a step towards progress, but a step deeper into the abyss of destruction. And the Iron Age, there was no longer a distinction between civilian and military. Children learned to march before they learned to write. Teenagers were sent to training camps, where loyalty to the survival of humanity was instilled through fear and rituals of violence. The uniform had become universal clothing, and any gesture of fragility, a song, a prayer, a smile, could be interpreted as treason. And many places, surveillance was total. Observation towers, armed patrols, warning systems. Villages had turned into outposts, cities into fortresses. Even the family had been redefined. There was no longer free love, but alliances between soldiers to produce new generations of fighters. Thus, humanity was slowly losing its soul, becoming a collective war machine. As the years passed, generals and military leaders became the new kings of Earth. Parliament, democracy, any form of debate had been considered a weakness. The voice of the people was reduced to a single cry, fight or die. Betrayal between factions was constant. Generals sold out to each other, alliances changed overnight, and any attempt to ask for peace was punished with death. Some leaders even secretly negotiated with the Nader army unknown entities that fueled the conflict only to feed their thirst for chaos and this atmosphere. Not even the Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life were perceived as people anymore. For some they were sacred symbols, for others puppets of stellar civilizations. But all recognized that their presence maintained a fragile balance between chaos and complete destruction. The geography of the planet had been rewritten by war. The great capitals, Paris, New York, Beijing, Cairo, were nothing more than smoking ruins. Entire continents had been torn apart by bombings and titanic battles between giants and human armies. Above the scorched deserts and plains, the sky was always red, covered in the ashes of millions of fires. The oceans were full of wreckage, and the forests had become empty fields where the trees stood like charred skeletons. The planet itself seemed to cry. Streams of acid rain fell on the people, and earthquakes, caused by gigantic battles, tore the earth into deep cracks. A typical day in the Iron Age was simple and terrifying. Waking up before sunrise, marching to the training grounds, endless rehearsals of shooting and attacking, followed by hours of work in the weapons forges, and the evening, propagandists gathered the people and repeated to them, "You are born to fight. You are born to defend. You are born to die if necessary." Those who resisted were either executed or used as examples of weakness. Only in secret, in catacombs and secret shelters, the Brotherhood of Tears, followers of the Witness of Life, still whispered about something else, about a world where man could sing again, dream, love. But these whispers were becoming rarer, covered by the metallic cry of the age. A century, 100 years in which no generation knew anything but the sound of weapons and the taste of fear. The old no longer remembered what it was like to live in peace, and the young did not believe that such a thing had ever been possible. Iron was not just the material of weapons. It was a metaphor for everything, for the hardened heart, for the rigid mind, for life reduced to mechanics. People had turned into pieces of armor, and as time passed, they began to fear that perhaps this was their true destiny. And yet, in the midst of this dark age, a spark remained. The Witness of Life continued to cry tears that healed, even though she was hunted. The Bridge of Light still tried to stop the massacres, even though she was considered a traitor. Some said that as long as these two men remained alive, even the Iron Age could not completely kill hope. But hope was fragile, frail, and the entire world was now a huge forge where people were molded not in their own image, but in the image of war. War is no longer an event, but a permanent state of human existence. The Iron Age is not just a historical era, but a collective wound, a time when man has ceased to be creative and has become only a destroyer. It is the period when the planet itself groans under the weight of war, and humanity, once capable of dreams and art, is reduced to a single function: fight. And however, in this complete darkness, the existence of the Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life becomes all the more essential, for they are the only living reminders that people can be more than pieces of iron in a killing machine. Chapter 12. Elyrians' Memories. Elyrian, the Stone of Memory, was more than a relic. It was a crystal heart in which the echoes of tens of thousands of Gorduy generations had gathered. Its glow was not constant, but pulsed like a living heart, sending waves of blue-gold light to everything around it. Whenever someone touched it, an avalanche of memories poured into consciousness, images, sounds, emotions, fragments of life that belonged to those who had lived before. Within it was the entire story of the giants, their birth, their journeys through the galaxies, the construction of great monuments, the collapse of worlds, and their rebirth from the ashes on a silent night, far from the battlefields. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life stood beside the giant stone. The Gorduy had brought Elyrian from the depths of their ancestral ship, and they had placed it in the middle of a stone temple built on the banks of the Nile. Around it, torches burned faintly, and shadows danced on the massive walls. The air vibrated with an energy that no man had ever felt before. "It is time to know their story," whispered an old Gorduy, touching the stone with his palm. Instantly, the crystalline surface trembled, and a blinding light rose into the air, weaving living holograms. The Bridge of Light saw the first images, an immense world, with mountains the size of continents and oceans in which ships of light sailed. T was the home planet of the giant Gorduy, with golden soils and skies the color of topaz. In those days, the Gorduy were not warriors, but builders, keepers of the harmony between matter and energy. They had learned to erect monuments that not only beautified, but also balanced the vibrations of the planets, transforming them into centers of cosmic tranquility. They then revealed scenes of colossal pyramids, larger than any ever erected on Earth. They were not simple tombs, but nodes of energy, capable of stabilizing the planet's magnetic fields and protecting it from stellar storms. When the Gorduy had arrived on Earth, in ancient times, they had not come as masters, but as architects of harmony. The pyramids of Egypt, Mexico, China had all been erected with the aim of preserving the balance between Earth and the universe. The witness of life felt tears flowing down her cheeks involuntarily. The memories were not just images, they were living emotions. She felt the giants' love for creation, felt their endless patience, their desire to leave behind a universe more stable than the one they had found. But then the images darkened. Fires descended from the stars, and their home world, Gorduy, was consumed by a cataclysm. A red star had exploded, and waves of radiation had transformed the oceans into desolate abysses. Gorduy they had survived by fleeing in huge ships, taking with them Eryon-Tal, the collective memory, so that their identity would not perish. From creators of harmony, they had become a people of exile, always carrying with them the nostalgia of a lost world. The light bridge felt the burden of that loss in its chest. "That's why they are so ruthless," he thought. From builders of peace, they have become warriors of despair. They defend their memory, even with blood. But the people, in their madness, could not or did not want to understand. The generals who had come to witness the ceremony looked on with suspicion. One of them, dressed in a black uniform, said in a cold voice, "What kind of magic is this? They are just illusions. They want to weaken our will. They are not illusions." The witness of life answered in a firm voice, "They are truths older than our own history. They were here before us, they built our temples, they protected us. Don't you see them? Don't you understand that they are not enemies?" But the people saw only power. What for the Elyrians and Gorduy was living memory, for the human leaders seemed only a psychological weapon, a method of subjugating minds. Beyond the walls of the temple, the armies of men continued to prepare, building ever larger, ever more cruel weapons. That night, the Bridge of Light laid its hands on Eryon-Tal. The instant he saw through the eyes of a Gorduy who had lived thousands of years before, it was on the construction site of a pyramid, and huge blocks of stone were being lifted by gravitational fields. But above the force of technology was the joy of collective work. The giants sang as they built, and their song turned into a resonance that made the stones float on their own, as if the earth itself supported them. Eryon-Tal fell to his knees. "These are not the monsters you paint in your speeches," he told the people. "They are keepers of the light. But we have been blinded by fear and power." Yet his words fell on deaf ears. The generals turned, giving orders. "We will continue to fight. What is in this stone will not divert us from our purpose. The world must be ours." The witness of life wept, feeling the chains of ignorance heavier than any sword. She knew that if the people had accepted Eryon-Tal's memories, the war could have stopped right then. But the blindness of power was too deep, and the days that followed, the stone was hidden by the Elyrians and Gorduy. They knew that not all people were ready to know its secrets. Only the Bridge of Light and The witness of life still had access to it, and every night spent in front of the crystal became a lesson for them. They understood how the Gorduy had traveled among the stars, how they had met other civilizations, how they had refused to conquer and had chosen to build. They understood that their true strength was not in the size of their bodies, but in the memory they carried. But the people on the surface continued to live in the Iron Age. For them, 𝕭𝖏𝒻𝒃 was just a strange object, perhaps even a danger. Their refusal to understand the memories of the giants was not only a proof of ignorance, but also a sentence for the future. Thus, 𝕭𝖏𝒃 remained like a silent heart, shining in the shadows, witness to a civilization that had built worlds and that now watched helplessly as another civilization, humanity, was digging its own grave through misunderstanding. The bridge of light and the witness of life had sworn to preserve that memory, even if people rejected it. They knew that a time would come, perhaps after more centuries of fire and blood, when someone would understand that power lies not in weapons, but in the collective memory of those who chose to build. For the moment, however, the shadows of war swallowed the planet. The memories of 𝕭𝖏𝒃 remained a hidden treasure, shining in silence, waiting for the moment when humanity would be ready to look into the eyes of the giants and see not monsters, but parents of harmony. Chapter 13. The Light of Elyrians. In the depths of a crystal temple, erected by the Elyrians on the ruins of a charred city, shone Elyrians, the heart of their knowledge. It was no inert stone, no cold machine, but a spherical organism of pure light, pulsating like a miniature sun. Its colors changed in a cosmic breath, blue, white, gold, sometimes blood red. For the Elyrians, Elyrians was more than memory. It was an eye that could look forward and backward, that deciphered the fabric of time and revealed not only what had been, but also what could be on a night when the sky was filled with scarred clouds. The witness of life and the bridge of light were brought before the sphere. Around them, translucent-bodied Elyrians formed a circle, raising their palms to the crystal ceiling. Thin rays rose from each hand that were joining in the core of the sphere. Elyrians began to vibrate, and its light flooded the room like a living tide. "Today you will see not only the past, but also what will be," one of the Elyrians said in a calm but grave voice. "And you will understand why your struggle is a path to nothingness." The sphere opened like a flower, and images burst from its heart. They were not gentle visions like those of 𝕭𝖏𝒃, but cruel, direct projections, impossible to deny. The light bridge first saw entire fields full of Earth soldiers, advancing with firearms and metal machines. It recognized them, generations born in the Iron Age. Children raised only to wield sword and rifle. But the picture changed, and those armies were shattered by the giants of Gorduy. Each step of the colossus tore the earth in two, each blow of their arms toppled walls, every breath from their chests sent winds that toppled buildings. The witness of life dug her nails into the crystal floor when the next vision struck her. Cities burned, oceans transformed into dark abysses, forests reduced to ashes. The sky itself seemed to be fading. "This is your future if you remain blind," the Elyrians said in chorus. "A world without song, without child, without hope. Your earth will be a graveyard that will only remind you of your stubbornness." But Elyrians did not stop there. The images were changing rapidly. People who raised arms against the Elyrians, but collapsed under the mental influence of those of light. Entire villages losing their will, turning into silent masses of subjects, children who were born without light in their eyes, because they had inherited only fear and hatred. "This is not a fixed prophecy," an Elyrian said, approaching the witness of life. "It is only the result of the threads that you humans stretch every day. If you choose to fight, this is the way. If you choose otherwise, Elyrians can show another way." The bridge of light, crushed by visions, stood up trembling. "Then show us the other way." The sphere blinked, changing color to emerald green. Other images burst from it. the earth covered again with forests, cities rebuilt not from concrete, but from light and living stone, fields blooming where today there were only craters. People, Gorduy and Elyrians lived together. Giants built temples of harmony with floating stones, Elyrians sang with their energies across the rivers. And people brought their creativity, and it was a future of peace, but fragile, like a flower that could be crushed by the first wrong step. The witness of life placed his hand on his heart and said, "This must be the way. People must see this, to know that there is not only death, but also rebirth." But the Elyrians shook their heads. Not all men are ready to see. Their minds are too narrowed by fear and the thirst for control. Many will look into Elyrians and say it is only a delusion, a plot of ours. And so it was, and the following weeks, leaders of the Earth Army were brought before the sphere. The Elyrians hoped that once the generals saw the future of destruction, the war would stop. But when the light of Elyrians showed them the fields of corpses and the poisoned oceans, they laughed bitterly. "Projections! Magic! A plot to bring us to our knees!" one of them shouted, raising his armed hand. "You will not scare us. We will build bigger, more powerful weapons. We will tear even the thought of you from our minds." Another, even more cruel, said, "Even if we burn the whole world, at least it would be our world, not yours." Those words fell like a knife into the heart of the witness of life. She remembered then the children without light, the villages without song, and understood that people did not just refuse to see, they hardened, preferring the death of life. Elyrians vibrated more strongly, as if the sphere itself felt the sadness. Its light turned a pale red, a sign of pain. The Elyrians raised their arms and tried to calm the energy, but they knew that the warning had been thrown in vain. One night, the bridge of light and the witness of life stood alone in the temple. Elyrians floated silent, like a sleeping sun. "It always shows us the same images," he said, his voice weary. "Destruction, ruin, death. People do not see." But when the light of Elyrians showed them the fields of corpses and the poisoned oceans, they laughed bitterly. "Projections! Magic! A plot to bring us to our knees," one of them shouted, raising his armed hand. "You will not scare us. We will build bigger, more powerful weapons. We will tear even the thought of you from our minds." Another, even more cruel, said, "Even if we burn the whole world, at least it would be our world, not yours." Those words fell like a knife into the heart of the witness of life. She remembered then the children without light, the villages without song, and understood that people did not just refuse to see, they hardened, preferring the death of life. Elyrians vibrated more strongly, as if the sphere itself felt the sadness. Its light turned a pale red, a sign of pain. The Elyrians raised their arms and tried to calm the energy, but they knew that the warning had been thrown in vain. One night, the bridge of light and the witness of life stood alone in the temple. Elyrians floated silent, like a sleeping sun. "It always shows us the same images," he said, his voice weary. "Destruction, ruin, death. People do not see. But I'm starting to think we can't even stop this." "No," she answered, wiping away her tears. "If it were impossible, Elyrians would not have shown us that green path, full of life. T means there is a chance. But it takes sacrifice, patience, something stronger than weapons or illusions." "And what could be stronger than hatred?" he asked, almost desperately. She looked at him gently. "Faith and love, as long as there is even one person who chooses differently. The future is not lost. And if that person has to be us, then that is what we will be, that moment." Elyrians brightened slightly, as if confirming the words of the witness of life. A green ray reached out to her and settled on her chest. She felt a warmth that penetrated her bones, not a power to destroy, but to heal, to gather. She understood now why the Elyrians had given her the title of witness of life, because in the midst of death, She had to be proof that life could be revived. But the war continued. People refused to believe, generals raised new weapons, and the giants of Gorduy prepared for new marches. The Elyrians, although they had shown their light, were increasingly seen as manipulators. Thus, the light of 𝕖𝐴𝐿 remained an open prophecy, a mirror of the future. T had shown people two paths, one of total ruin, the other of rebirth. But people, fierce, walked the path of blood. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life knew then that their mission was not to stop the war on the spot, but to keep alive that small chance, that green flower in the heart of the future, until humanity was ready to truly see it. Chapter 14. Shadow Warriors. A century had already passed since the first blows between the humans, Gorduy, and the Elyrians. The earth had become a wound that would not heal. Cities were smoking ruins, oceans had swallowed entire fields, and mountains had been split by weapons so colossal that even history could not keep up with them. In the midst of this chaos, a new generation of people was born, not to build, not to love, but to fight. They were known by a single name that aroused shivers, the Shadow Warriors. These children were not born into a house, were not cradled in a mother's arms, and did not hear lullabies. They were born in underground bunkers, in cold laboratories where the light was never friendly. Their first memories were the cries of their commanders, the echo of boots on metal floors, and the sound of calibrated weapons. From an early age, a sword, a laser rifle, or a device that counteracted the influence of the Elyrians was put in their hands. "You are not children, you are weapons," the instructors told them, men with empty eyes, without a trace of mercy. "You will breathe to fight, you will live to die, and dying, you will save humanity." None of these children knew what play meant. They did not know what joy was. When one of them smiled, the others looked at him as a traitor. When one cried, he was punished with days of isolation in a silent cell, where darkness devoured his soul. At 12 years old, each child went through the shadow trial. He was thrown in an underground arena where holograms of giant Gorduy and Elyrian figures of light attacked them from all sides. Only those who managed to kill the illusions, without hesitation, were considered worthy. Those who collapsed in fear did not leave the arena. The shadow of the warriors did not forgive weakness. Thus, at the age of 18, the young men emerged from the bunkers like ghosts. Their bodies were trained to resist pain, their minds were programmed to reject the Elyrians' mental control. Underground doctors inoculated them with serums that stiffened their nerves and hardened their will, and implants reduced their emotions. Even their dreams were controlled. A mental generator sent images of battle into their minds even when they slept, so that even their subconscious would not forget about the war. They were the lost children of humanity, but for the generals who remained alive, they were salvation. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life learned of their existence on a night when the noise of the battle had briefly died down. Caravan of prisoners, all young men of the same age, passed through a valley. Their eyes were unblinking, their breathing was synchronized, and their gait had a mechanical precision. "Who are they?" asked the Witness of Life, trembling at the sight of them. "They don't look human. They don't look alive," an old refugee answered. "They are the Shadow Warriors, a generation made to know nothing but hatred. They have no mother, no father, no songs. They only have weapons." The Lightbridge put his hands to his temples, feeling a cold shiver. "This is not the salvation of humanity, T is its slow death. If these are the future, then no Oriontal and no 𝕖𝐿 will be able to help us." The Shadow Warriors' first impact on the battle was devastating. In a confrontation on the frozen plains of the north, tens of thousands of Gorduy soldiers marched like living fortresses. Usually, their mere appearance was enough to crush the morale of the people, but this time, the young warriors did not flinch, they did not flee, they did not stagger under the weight of they threw themselves at the giants with weapons that vibrated at special frequencies, capable of breaking Gorduy''s armor. One of the young men managed to climb onto the arm of a giant, plunge his blade into his throat, and knock him to the ground. Gorduy''s cry echoed across the icy plain, a cry that people had never heard before. For the first time, the giants felt what it meant to be wounded. But victory came at a terrible price. The shadow warriors did not fear death. Many threw themselves with explosive weapons at their enemies, sacrificing themselves with cold efficiency. Only charred bodies and fragments of metal remained on the field, and the air smelled of ash and blood. The Elyrians tried to stop them, using the power of thought, but the minds of the young were so conditioned, so corseted in dogmas and serums, that their influence did not take root, and no murmur of peace penetrated them. Only the command, "Fight, kill, survive." The witness of life watched these scenes and felt such deep pain that her tears fell to the ground like drops of fire. She understood then that these children were not guilty. They were only the result of the despair of a humanity that had refused to see another way. Tonight, in hiding places, she tried to reach their souls. Some were captured wounded and brought to the camp's refugees. She touched their foreheads, whispering words of comfort. "You are not just a weapon. You are not just a shadow. You are life. You are hidden light." But most of the time, the young people did not respond. Their eyes remained empty, their lips closed. Only rarely did one of them twitch, as if a spark were lit deep within. The witness of life gathered those moments like fragile treasures. The bridge of light, on the other hand, felt the burden of another guilt. "I swore to defend these civilizations," he said one evening. "But how can I raise my sword against children who have chosen nothing? How can I kill a shadow when the shadow is made of our light?" She replied, "Don't kill them, defend them. Even if that means fighting against those who created them. They are not the enemies. They are the victims. And our mission is not only to be a shield for Gorduy and the Elyrians, but also to be a heart for the people who have forgotten how to feel." But the shadow warriors were not just weapons in the field. They had become a symbol. The general's propaganda portrayed them as heroes, as true sons of the earth. The common people, tired of the war, had begun to believe that only this new generation could bring victory. Temples of war were erected in their honor, and death songs echoed in the camps, and entire people now worshipped the shadow. And, in this way, the future of the earth was increasingly tied to the darkness it had created. Thus, the chapter of the Shadow Warriors marked a turning point in the war. For the first time, humans had managed to inflict serious wounds on the Gorduy giants and resist the power of the Elyrians. But the victory was a bitter one, for, instead of bringing hope, it brought a crueler truth. Humans were no longer different from the enemies they hated. Through the Shadow Warriors, humanity had lost the last shred of its innocence. And even though the bodies of these young men rose like colossuses on the battlefields, their souls were already buried. Chapter 15. The Battle of the Ocean of Fire. The Ocean of Fire had not always been a place of destruction. Men had once called it the Ruby Sea, for the reflections of the sunset that embraced the waves with purple hues. But after a century of war, the sea had been transformed into a permanent battlefield. The shores burned from explosions, the waters were full of metal debris, and columns of toxic vapors rose above the waves. The fleets of humanity, increasingly numerous, had been gathered there for a confrontation that promised to tip the scales. It seemed to the generals that victory was within reach. They had hundreds of warships at their disposal, equipped with weapons specially designed to counter the Gorduy massifs. Each vessel carried vibration cannons capable of weakening the body structure of the giants and electromagnetic fields designed to disrupt the telepathic links of the Elyrians. And at the heart of each ship was a unit of shadow warriors, trained to resist any foreign influence. The atmosphere was tense. Before the storm, people looked at the dark sky, where the clouds swayed like black walls. "Today the future is decided," said each commander. Today there is no turning back. From the depths of the waters, the Gorduy came. Not as soldiers, but as an army of colossi emerged from the depths, as if the ocean itself were their homeland. Their feet touched the seabed, but their bodies rose above the waves like mountains. Their chests glowed with bluish energy, and each step raised waves larger than the ships. The first contact was devastating to an entire fleet. Arranged in a front line, opened fire with missiles and lasers. The sky lit up as if anew. Sun had risen, but Gorduy, with a simple movement of his arms, huge waves crashed over the ships. Dozens of ships were swallowed instantly. The cries of the sailors mingled with the roar of the waters, and the sea turned red. A giant, twice as tall as the others, raised his fists and let them fall into the water. The shock wave destroyed 4 cruisers in an instant. The ships broke in 2, and their flames rose into the air like torches of despair. The shadow warriors reacted with terrifying discipline. From the holds of the ships, they jumped onto the deck, activating magnetic arcs that allowed them to propel themselves directly towards the giants. With vibrating blades and contact explosives, they threw themselves at the bodies of Gorduy, trying to pierce their energy shells. Many died instantly crushed by the giants' palms or swallowed by the waves. But a few managed to leave their mark. Gorduy fell to his knees, his throat slit, and the sea trembled at his fall. But victory was illusory. For every giant slain, 10 more rose from the depths. The Gorduy fought not for conquest, but to show that their power could not be challenged. Amidst the chaos, the Elyrians descended, trying to stop the massacre. Spheres of light floated above the waters, sending waves of calm into human minds. For a moment, the battle subsided, and a few soldiers dropped their weapons, their tears melting in the salty air. But the generals reacted immediately. Resist the influence. Shadows, defend the front. Warriors of the shadow, immunized against mental suggestion, they activated their devices and broke the balance. The Elyrians' light was repelled, and the battle broke out again with even greater fury. Eryon-Tal, the Bridge of Light, watched the scene from a cliff on the shore. He felt his heart torn. "This is no battle. It is the end of the world," he whispered. Beside him, Sael-Rien, the witness of life, wept silently. The people have made the ocean an altar of death, and Gorduy welcomes it with joy. 4 days, the battle did not stop. Each night was lit by explosions, each sunrise brought new screams. The fleets of humanity were crushed one by one. When resources dwindled, the generals sent the shadow warriors to sacrifice themselves in suicide attacks. A group of 50 young men threw themselves upon a giant Gorduy, fixing explosives above its energy heart. Their cry was mute, cold, devoid of emotion. The explosion shattered the colossus, and them too. The ocean of fire was lit up by a mushroom of energy that blinded the sky. The people jubilated, but the witness of life covered its face. There are no more men. There are shadows burning for a cause without a future. When the 3rd day of the battle came, the sea was no longer an ocean, but a vast expanse of blood and fire. The fleets of humanity had been reduced by half. The Gorduy had lost a few of their own, but the waves continued to bring new and new giants. And a moment of silence. A Gorduy raised a mountain of water and threw it over the entire central fleet. 20 ships collapsed instantly. The generals shouted orders, but no one listened. The soldiers, overcome with fear, jumped into the water, only to be crushed by the waves. And in the midst of the chaos, Eryon-Tal raised his Tal, the stone of memory. "Enough," he shouted. "This ocean can take no more blood." But his voice was swallowed by the roar. No one was listening to him. The Battle of the Ocean of Fire ended with a bitter victory for Gorduy. Humanity had lost almost 3/4 of its fleets. The shores were covered with corpses, the sky with smoke. Not a single song was heard after that, only silence. For Gorduy, it was a demonstration. The Earth could gather all its forces, but the giants could not be stopped. For humans, it was the beginning of absolute despair. They no longer had fleets, but only the shadow warriors. And even they could not change the balance. The witness of life leaned on the red sand and whispered, "This was not just a battle, it was a prayer to death." And death answered. Chapter 16. The Broken Earth. After the Battle of the Ocean of Fire, the Earth was no longer the same. Continent after continent, the planet began to weep its wounds. It was not just the loss of people and cities, it was the very geological, ecological, and spiritual structure of the world that was falling apart. The winds carried ash and smoke, the rivers had been contaminated by the toxic fluids left by the crashed fleets, and the sea had become a poison that stretched to the heart of the continents. The Ocean of Fire, the symbol of the recent apocalypse, was no longer just a battlefield, but a reservoir of corrupted energy. Its red and black waters spilled into the adjacent oceans, gradually poisoning marine life. Fish struggled helplessly, and corals turned into shattered white skeletons, no longer able to support the ecosystems that once provided food and shelter on the continents. The effects of the destruction were dramatic. Mountains, once symbols of stability, had cracked, collapsing into deep valleys and lakes of ash. Cities that had withstood human bombardment or Gorduy attacks now trembled under their own weight. Streets were cracked, buildings collapsed with a deafening thud, and bridges and railroads were broken, connecting people only with the memory of what had once been. The shadow warriors, the generation of children turned into weapons, were now among the survivors. But they no longer played the role of saviors. They were witnesses to an Earth that was crumbling under its own struggles. Their bodies, highly trained for battle, now felt the weight of their losses. Former comrades disappeared under falling rocks or in the explosion of toxic waste. Their minds, programmed not to feel fear, had begun to realize the true scale of the disaster, and in the midst of this chaos, Eryon-Tal and Sael-Rien stood on the top of a cliff that looked out over a poisoned ocean. The Bridge of Light felt the devastating vibrations of Eryon-Tal. Every contaminated wave, every collapse of a continent was recorded in the crystal. Every echo of the Gorduy generations whispering their ancestral pain. At the same time, the witness of life felt how Elyrians pulsed in rhythm with the planet, a living pain that tried to send a warning, but which was ignored by the people. "We are witnesses to the end," Eryon-Tal said, his voice trembling with frustration and sadness. "This is no longer a war, it is self-destruction." Sael-Rien looked at him with gentle but fierce eyes. "But we cannot give up. There is still a spark. Even if continent after continent collapses, even if the oceans become poisoned, we can still preserve what is pure, what is worth saving." But the rescue was complicated. The people, in the midst of despair, had begun to extract toxic resources from the sea and land, creating weapons and fuels that hastened death rather than protected the survivors. Underground factories supplied munitions that generated clouds of smoke and gases that destroyed the remaining vegetation and poisoned the air. Each day brought epidemics, famines, and the loss of innocent life. The Gorduy, though horrified and invincible, watched with cold amazement as the humans, those they viewed as inferiors, destroyed their own planet at their own pace. "They are their own enemies," one of them whispered to the others. "We don't need to kill everything. They do it themselves." The Elyrians tried to intervene, sending waves of calm and thoughts of restoration. But the minds of the people were corseted with hatred and fear. The Elyrians' messages were filtered by despair and ambition, transforming the healing light into shadows of confusion. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life attempted to use the power of the crystal and the sphere to stabilize the continents and oceans. Eryon-Tal transmitted direct instructions to the tectonic plates, attempting to slow the sinking of the continental masses. Elyrians projected energies of purity into the waters, attempting to neutralize the toxins. But their power, however great, was limited by the number and intensity of the destruction already wrought by the war. Meanwhile, the human survivors built camps in the hills and mountains, but each refuge was temporary. The earth, in its silent cry, rejected them. Frequent earthquakes, landslides, and poisonous waves tore at their shelters. Any hope seemed fragile, like a leaf tossed in the devastating wind of the apocalypse. And this broken world, the bond between Eryon-Tal and Sael-Rien deepened. They were no longer just messengers and witnesses, no longer just the bridge of light and the witness of life. They had become the only stabilizers of a universe that people had refused to protect. Every decision they made had direct effects. A toxic wave no longer reached the wrong village, a mountain no longer collapsed on innocent children, a river was purified enough to add a few days of life. But even with this power, they felt the weight of the impossible. Eryon-Tal vibrated under the palms of the Bridge of Light, while the vibrations of the Gorduy generations transmitted to them the eternal pain of destruction. Elyrian sail pulsed to the rhythm of life that still existed, but its energy seemed insufficient to restore what had been lost. As the months passed, the continents continued to give way, and the poisoned ocean swallowed more and more land. The surviving humans had become more suspicious and violent, transforming every refuge into a fortress, and the shadow warriors, fewer and fewer, remained tireless guardians of a world that was no longer theirs. Operation Broken Earth ended with a disastrous panorama. Sunken continents, poisoned seas, burned forests, cities reduced to ruins. But in the midst of this devastation, Eryon-Tal and Sael-Rien watched with eyes lit by hope. They knew that life, even when almost everything is lost, can still be reborn. And in this fragile thought, humans and alien civilizations could still find a chance for reconciliation, if their will could keep up with the responsibility that had been entrusted to them. Chapter 17. Fortresses of Resistance. After the earth had been torn apart by wars, sinkings, and poisoned waters, humanity seemed all but defeated. Continent after continent collapsed under the weight of destruction, and fleets were nothing more than floating relics of molten metal and shattered wood. But from the ashes of a devastated world rose the last bastions, the fortresses of resistance, places where people still believed they could halt the planet's decline and, at the same time, avenge their losses. These fortresses were not simple fortresses. They were fortified metropolises, built on cliffs, on mountaintops, or in the depths of the subterranean depths, where neither Gorduy's fire nor the Elyrians' manipulative light could penetrate. Stone and metal walls, underground tunnels, heavy artillery, and clandestine laboratories formed a labyrinth of defenses that seemed impossible to penetrate. Inside them, the survivors had built a rigid society, based on discipline, order, and fanaticism. "There is no peace anymore," said each leader. "There is no trust. There is no love. There is only struggle and survival." And the people believed these words. The young people, raised from the beginning in the ruins of the cities, had learned to respect only the rules of the fortresses and their commanders. Fanaticism was manifested not through religious faith, but through absolute loyalty to the bastions that offered them shelter in every corner. The symbols of the fortresses of resistance were proudly displayed: black banners, sculptures that represented historical battles with giants and holograms of the shadow warriors who guarded the entrances. The shadow warriors, although reduced in number, continued to be the main pillar of the defense. They no longer had any trace of innocence. Their bodies were tattooed with symbols of war, and their cold eyes no longer blinked at the sight of suffering. Every gesture was calculated, every move an act of survival. But behind this steel exterior, some of them held fragile crumbs of humanity, memories of Eryon-Tal and Sael-Rien, of the days when the world seemed brighter. The resistance fortresses were both refuge and war school. The young men were trained not only to withstand the attacks of the giant Gorduy or protect themselves from the manipulations of the Elyrians, but also to kill without remorse. Each fortress had special rooms where combat simulations were extremely realistic, gigantic holograms, sound effects and vibrations that made the earth tremble. The lessons did not stop at night. Sleep was monitored, and dreams were controlled by technologies that forced them to practice attacks and defenses until their reflexes became instincts. The inhabitants learned that weakness was equivalent to death, and fanaticism was the surest way to survival. In the inner courtyards of the fortresses, daily oath rituals and demonstrations of power were held. The young people raised their weapons and swore eternal loyalty to the fortress, firmly believing that only in this way could humanity survive. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life observed these manifestations with a mixture of sadness and hope. They knew their role. They protected the balance between the people who were bending under the weight of war and the alien forces. However, their attempts to temper the fanaticism of the people were limited. Whenever they intervened, the citizens believed that Eryon-Tal and Sael-Rien favored the enemy, and each a gesture of compassion was interpreted as weakness. However, the Bridge of Light tried to convey essential principles. Do not let hatred consume you completely. Use this power for protection, not destruction. The Witness of Life added, as difficult as it may be, there is still a way. When the eyes open, the heart can guide the mind. Try not to forget that. But their messages hit invisible walls. The fanaticism of the people was fueled by fear, despair, and the memory of all the losses suffered in wars. Even the shadow warriors, who had once been innocent and pure, now viewed any intervention with suspicion and absolute obedience to orders. The fortresses were not just fortresses of defense, but also propaganda centers. It seemed to the surviving generals that morale had to be manipulated to maintain discipline and efficiency. Films, holograms, and audio messages were projected in which the Gorduy giants were demonized, and the Elyrians were presented as entities seeking to destroy humanity. Any form of doubt was considered treason and was immediately punished. Young shadow warrior, on his first real mission, asked why he was fighting so desperately against the giants who seemed to want nothing more than peace. His instructor replied dryly, "The reason doesn't matter. If you don't fight, you die. If you die, everything collapses." Loyalty needs no meaning. As the months passed, the fortresses of resistance became a symbol of the last hope. The remaining cities on the continent were connected by tunnels and underground networks, forming a vast defensive network. Communication between the cities was done through light signals and encrypted messages to prevent Elyrians' interventions or Gorduy attacks. Each city was autonomous but solidary, and all the inhabitants believed that their fight against the alien forces was the only way to save the human race. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life periodically visited these cities. They tried to provide moral support, help repair the damage, and bring wisdom to temper the excess violence. Despite their efforts, the tension was constantly growing. People saw in every step of the two symbols of power that they could not control, which generated internal conflicts. However, in some corners of the cities, hope was kindled. Small groups of young shadow warriors had begun to listen to the words of the Witness of Life. They met in secretly, listening to stories about the Bridge of Light and about worlds where humans and aliens coexisted without blood. These moments were fragile, like sparks in the darkness, but they represented the promise of a better world. The fortresses of resistance show duality. People defend themselves with fanaticism, building bastions and generating order in chaos, but inside them there are still fragments of humanity that can be reborn. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life become beacons of moral balance, symbols of hope in an almost lost world. The image of humanity's last fortress is taking shape: fortified fortresses, severe disciplines, fanaticism, and a generation of shadow warriors ready to fight at any cost. But in the midst of this rigid organization, sparks of humanity and compassion bring the first signs that Earth could be reborn. Chapter 18. the witness of life and the children of the stars. After a century of chaos, the earth had become an open wound, a vast field of ash and ruins. The ocean of fire still burned on the horizon, and the fortresses of resistance remained bastions of fear and fanaticism. In this war-torn landscape, where hope seemed impossible, the witness of life, Sael-Rien, chose to seek another path. She knew that weapons could no longer save the world, but only the soul, and so she began to gather around her those who still believed in peace, the children of the stars.It. All began with a group of orphan children, found among the ruins of a fortress burned by the Gorduy giants. Sael-Rien sheltered them in a cave lit by natural crystals, a place where rays penetrated through cracks and reflected like fragile rainbows over the walls. The children watched her with fear at first, but her quiet voice, her warm touch, and the light that surrounded her body soothed their fear. "All is not lost," she told them, caressing their dirty foreheads. "The stars have not forgotten us, and you are their light on this broken earth." From that moment on, the news of the Life Witness shelter spread like a whisper. Survivors from hidden villages, from lost camps, or even from the resistance fortresses began to send their children to her. There were boys and girls of all ages, some barely learning to walk, others already marked by fighting, but all carrying the same secret desire in their souls, to live without fear. Sael-Rien was not only a protector, but also an educator. Around her, she built a school of the heart, a community where learning came not from weapons, but from stories, songs, and stars. Every evening, she gathered them around the fire and spoke to them about the beauty of the universe, about the Gorduy and Elyan civilizations as they really were, not as the propaganda of the people had painted them. "The Gorduy are not just stone giants," she told them, holding fragments of Eryon-Tal in her hands. "They built so that the world would last. Their pyramids are the signs of memory, not the weapons of war. The Elyans are not just shadows in your minds," she added, showing them the light of Elyrs. "They are people of light, capable of lifting thoughts from the darkness. They did not come to destroy us, but to teach us to overcome our limits." The children listened with wide eyes, and in their gazes something rare began to be born. Curiosity was not fear, it was not hatred, but the desire to know. Over time, the children of the stars began to create their own symbols, and the cave in the bright light. They drew stars, suns, and planets on the walls, imagining worlds where wars did not exist. Some learned to play rudimentary instruments. Others wrote their first poems about life beyond chaos. Sael-Rien taught them to look at the night sky and read the signs of the constellations. "The stars are teachers older than all men and giants," she told them. "If you listen to them, you will understand that everything has a cycle. Wars die out, but the light remains." Soon, these children began to be called children of the stars, not only because they looked at the sky, but because they had become carriers of a new seed of hope. But their path was not without dangers. The resistant strongholds viewed them with suspicion. The generals believed that Sael-Rien spread weakness, that she urged the young to give up fighting and dream. Human spies infiltrated among the refugees to find out what was happening in the Life Witness camp. Some children were being abducted back and forced to undergo military training. But Sael-Rien was not intimidated. She knew that any seed of peace had to be defended with patience, not with weapons. When a group of soldiers tried to destroy the shelter, she did not raise her sword. Instead, she stepped forward and spoke in a voice that resonated in everyone's hearts. "If you want to kill, kill me, but let the children live. They are not your enemies, but your future." The soldiers, although trained not to give in, felt their minds touched by Sael-Rien's light. Some left in shame, others remained stunned, unable to raise their weapons. Thus, for the first time, the strength of the Life Witness defeated fanaticism not through violence, but through the purity of truth. The children of the stars were not just sheltered and educated. they were transformed over time. Some of them developed unexpected abilities. A boy could feel echoes of the past when they touched fragments of stone, as if Eryon-Tal were sending whispers through him. A little girl was able to project colored lights around her, reminiscent of the energy of the Elyrians. Others had intuitions, dreams, or premonitions that guided them in their decisions. Sael-Rien understood that these children were not random. They represented a bridge between humans and ancient civilizations. They were proof that the oath taken on Elyan had not been in vain. Humanity could still be reborn, but only through a new generation, raised in the spirit of peace. As the children of the stars grew, they began to emerge from their shelters and carry the message of the witness of life to villages and ruins. They went in groups, little ones, singing songs about the stars and telling about the beauty of other worlds. Some were driven away, others beaten, but they always returned. And in the hearts of war-weary people, a question began to creep in: maybe there is another way? The resistant strongholds watched this phenomenon with increasing anxiety. Some generals wanted to completely destroy the witness of life community. But others, in secret, sent their own children to it, recognizing that the war could no longer last indefinitely. The Witness of Life chapter and the Children of the Stars mark an essential turning point. In the midst of chaos and a humanity devoted exclusively to the fight, Sael-Rien manages to plant the seed of hope. Children raised in the light of the stars become bearers of a new legacy, one that transcends hatred and reminds us that true power lies not in weapons, but in compassion, knowledge, and unity. Thus, the 100 Years' War is no longer just a story of blood and ruins, but also a story about the rebirth of a world within the hearts of the most fragile. The children of the stars will be the future that decides whether the broken planet will remain prey to hatred or learn to shine again. Chapter 19: Shadow of the Rebels. The world of Earth was already in a spiral of continuous destruction. Continent after continent had been shattered by the force of the giant Gorduy, and the minds of men were troubled and weakened by the influence of the Elyrians. Yet, even amidst the ruins, the human spirit, fierce, stubborn, and often blinded by ambition, continued to seek a path to revenge. From the depths of the earth, from secret laboratories hidden under ruins, and from the buried warehouses of ancient empires, a new movement was beginning to take shape: the Shadow of the Rebels. This faction was not made up of visible generals or leaders recognized by the crowd. They were people left outside the structures of the fortresses of resistance, individuals obsessed with the idea that Gorduy and the Elyrians were not gods or invincible beings, but only opponents who had not yet been struck by the weapon. They were united by a single belief: that the world's forgotten technology could be rediscovered and turned into a curse for the giants. The first rumors of their discovery emerged from the underground of East Asia, where a team of engineers and alchemists, working in the dark, unearthed a relic from the age of forbidden experiments. It was an unknown alloy, created by fusing rare metals with fragments fallen from the sky, fragments of meteorites that carried echoes of cosmic energy within them. This material, which they called Black Azoth, had an unprecedented property. It resonated with the vibrations of the Gorduy, breaking the barrier of their invulnerability. When the first prototype was tested, the rebels sent a spear coated with Black Azoth against a wandering Gorduy, trapped in an isolated valley. The giant, otherwise immune to conventional weapons, staggered under the blow and let out a roar that shook the earth. His stone skin cracked, and sparks of blue light shot from the wounds. For the first time, the invulnerability of the ancient civilization had been broken. Those who witnessed that moment thought they were witnessing a miracle. But it was no miracle, but the beginning of a new nightmare. The shadow of the rebels spread quickly, drawing into its ranks deserting soldiers, desperate engineers, mercenaries without a homeland, and fanatics who no longer recognized the authority of any city and hidden places. Their forges produced unique weapons: short swords of Azoth, arrows coated with black powder, and even the first primitive machines capable of launching huge projectiles. Around them, a myth took shape, a myth that said that humans could not only resist, but could even kill giants. Eryon-Tal, the Bridge of Light, learned of these experiments through whispers brought by the winds of war. When he tried to reach the faction to stop them, he was met with hostility. "You betrayed us long ago, messenger," shouted one of the leaders, a man with eyes shadowed by sleepless nights and hands stained with metal dust. "You have chosen to side with the giants and the light. But we are the true men, we will not kneel." Eryon-Tal tried to explain his oath, his role as a bridge between worlds, but his words no longer carried weight. The people who had lost everything no longer listened to the voice of reason. They saw only a chance to rise up against those they considered oppressors and the camp of the witness of life. Sael-Rien felt that a new shadow was being born over the world. The children of the stars dreamed more, and more often of scenes of blood and black metal, as if the future itself was sending them warnings. She knew that these weapons brought no salvation, but only a new level of destruction. "Black Azoth is not the gift of men," she told them. "It comes from the stars, but it is corrupted by the desire for war. Whoever uses it will burn from within." And yet, her warnings could not stop the march of the shadow. The first major confrontation took place near the ruins of a sunken capital. The Gorduy, on a mission to restore tectonic balance, were attacked by a group of rebels armed with spears and arrows of Black Azoth. The blows penetrated the giant's shells, and 2 of them fell. The earth shook, and the nearby ocean began to boil under there. Screams of agony. The victory of the people was shouted across the continent. For the first time in decades, it seemed that the giants were no longer invincible. But the victory quickly turned into a curse. The dying bodies of the Gorduy collapsed across the earth, crushing entire villages and releasing unstable cosmic energies. Entire areas became barren, the ground cracked, and the air filled with toxic dust. And their attempt to show their power, the people had only deepened the wound of the planet. The the rebels, emboldened by this victory, became radicalized. They no longer fought for survival, but for extermination, and their speeches, "Gorduy and the Elyrians had to be wiped off the face of the earth, and humanity would remain the sole master." But something strange was happening in their ranks. Those who wielded Black Azoth too much began to change. Their eyes turned dark, their skin became covered with cracks like stone, and their minds were saturated with uncontrollable rage. It was as if the cosmic metal itself was corrupting them, transforming them into living shadow, more monsters than people. Eryon-Tal and Sael-Rien tried to warn both civilizations. "If this material spreads, neither you nor we will be safe," the Light Bridge said before the Joint Council. But the Gorduy responded with anger. The death of their brothers demanded revenge. The Elyrians, on the other hand, felt that the shadows of the metal were corrupting reality itself, creating a future impossible to save. And so, instead of peace, each step of the rebels pushed the world towards the abyss. The chapter "Shadow of the Rebels" marks a new stage in the 100 Years' War. People, thirsty for power and blinded by hatred, discover weapons that can hurt even the giants of Gorduy. But behind this victory lies a terrifying reality. Any blow given to the giants breaks the balance of the planet, and the Black Azoth corrupts even the souls of those who wield it. Thus, humanity no longer fights only against ancient civilizations, but also against its own shadow, born of the desire for revenge. And this darkness, the only light, remains the oath of the point of light and the witness of life, but as long as they can prevent the world from collapsing. Chapter 20. The Bridge of Light and the Sacrifice. The earth trembled on the edge of an irreversible abyss. Following the rise of the shadow of the rebels and the discovery of Black Azoth, the Gorduy giants had been wounded, the Elyrians were troubled, and the people, hungry for power, no longer recognized any authority except their desire for revenge. From the ashes of the conflict, an even greater catastrophe was preparing to strike the world. Under the ruins of an old militarized state, the shadow of the rebels had found a forbidden treasure, the remains of a nuclear arsenal from bygone ages. Weapons that had been considered the end of the world centuries before, kept in a cold sleep, locked by codes and automatic mechanisms. But the secret codes were no longer impenetrable. Obsessed minds and hands loaded with black azoth forced the safes and awakened the dormant power. Now, deep within the earth, the bombs were preparing their incandescent cores. A single explosion could tear apart continents, and several, launched simultaneously, would bring complete apocalypse. 𝕿𝖏𝖃, the Bridge of Light, was the first to feel the vibration of this threat. Not through sight, but through his connection to the fabric of the world. He sat in sacred meditation between two collapsed temples. The silence was shattered by a dull roar, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Visions overwhelmed him, blinding flames rising like artificial suns, cities consumed in an instant, seas turned to steam, and human shadows melting before he could cry out. He knew that if the nuclear weapons were unleashed, neither Gorduy, nor the Elyrians, nor the humans would survive. The planet would be thrown into an eternal night, covered in dust and radiation. And then his oath, to keep the bridge between worlds, would be shattered forever. With heavy but determined steps, Eryon-Tal set off toward the epicenter of the threat. Sael-Rien, the witness of life, tried to stop him. "It is not your place to burn for the madness of men," she told him, her eyes filling with tears. "You are the link, Eryon. Without you hope falls. If you enter the heart of this storm, you will lose more than your body. You will lose your light." He answered with a calmness that hid despair. "If I do not, who else? You are the witness of life. Keep the flame of the children. I am the bridge, and if I must break for the world to cross the abyss, so be it." In the dungeons that hid the arsenal, the shadow of the rebels celebrated their imminent victory. Their leaders planned to use their weapons not only against Gorduy and the Elyrians, but also against the human cities that refused to join them. "Who is not with us is dead." Their stony voice said, "It was the delirium of absolute power, blinded by the belief that survival could be built on the ashes of other.Eryon-Tal descended among them not as a warrior, but as a messenger. Its bluish light bathed the dark tunnels, and for a moment even the fanatics fell silent. But when he asked them to stop, the answer came in the form of bullets and black spears. The projectiles pierced him, but they did not harm his flesh. They struck at his very essence. Each contact with the black azoth was like an ice burn, a rupture in his connection to light. Still, Eryon moved forward, step by step, until he reached the control room where the devices were readied for triggering. In front of the console, time had almost collapsed. Indicators lit up, mechanisms vibrated, and the first activation cycle began. Human hand, pressing a button, could have condemned the entire globe. Eryon-Tal gathered his entire being, calling upon the light of the oath. He knew he no longer had the strength to physically disarm the entire arsenal. The only solution was to use his essence as a barrier, to melt the circuits with his own light and bind the energy within himself. But this act was not a simple gesture. It meant giving up a part of his being, to break away from eternity and become vulnerable as a mortal. "To be the bridge and the ashes," he whispered. "To burn, so that others can breathe." Light flowed from his chest like a waterfall. Every fiber of his being unraveled and penetrated the mechanisms of the bombs. The faces of those present were blinded, and their cries were drowned out by a cosmic roar. Eryon felt his light transform into chains of fire white, binding the nuclear core of the weapons and putting it to sleep. But the price was terrible. With each bond, a part of him broke forever. His body began to resemble cracked glass, through which sparks played frantically. His eyes, once mirrors of the sky, had become two suns ready to go out. Knew that after this act he would never be the same. Maybe he would never be at all. The rebel shadow, maddened with rage, tried to stop him. But the energy released by Eryon-Tal repelled them. The black azoth in their weapons blackened and crumbled at the touch of light, as if matter itself refused to fight any more. For the first time, the shadow was disarmed by the simple power of sacrifice. And then the miracle happened. The bombs, one by one, went off. The indicators stopped, their cyclicity was broken, and the mechanisms remained paralyzed, frozen in silence. The nuclear arsenal was reduced to simple metal shells. But Eryon-Tal was no longer among them as before. The light bridge was on its knees, breathing heavily, and its aura was fading like a candle at its end. Sael-Rien ran to him, caught him in her arms, and felt the cold in his body. "Why?" she asked him, crying. "Why did you give everything for those who betrayed you?" Eryon smiled weakly. "Because the bridge does not ask who crosses it. Sael-Rien only unites the shores. Was the bridge, even for the lost. His sacrifice changed the course of the war. Humanity, witnessing what had happened, began to waver in its fanaticism. Even some of the rebels, seeing how a son of other worlds burned his being to save the planet, began to ask themselves questions. But at the same time, Eryon's weakness left the balance fragile. The Bridge of Light was no longer whole, and in the distance, the shadows felt it. The forces of chaos were gaining courage, knowing that the one who held the balance no longer had the power. Before.It is the turning point of the epic, the moment when Eryon-Tal, symbol of connection and oath, sacrifices his essence to stop the nuclear catastrophe. In this act, he demonstrates that the true bridge is not just between civilizations, but between life and death, between despair and hope. But the price remains written in the blood of the world. The Bridge of Light will never be whole again, and his sacrifice becomes a sad song, a warning and a promise all at once. Chapter 21. The Silence of the Arms. 100 years had passed since the beginning of the war that had consumed the world, a century of iron, fire, and ash, in which humanity, Gorduy and the Elyrians had measured their strength, and the planet had been transformed into a living wound. Of the forests that once covered the continents, only islands of green remained, hidden in inaccessible valleys. Of the blue oceans, sung in ancient legends, there remained dark expanses, full of poisons and ash. For people, every day had become a fight not for victory, but for survival. Cities had collapsed under the blows of the Gorduy giants, and the fortresses of resistance had been gnawed by fanaticism and hunger. Children were born with wide, naked eyes, never having seen the clear sky. The old weapons had been used to ruin, and the last factories they had fallen silent. The cannons now lay covered in rust, and the soldiers, once trained to live only for battle, threw their weapons into the dust, for they had nothing left to defend. The fatigue was not merely physical, but deep in the blood and bones. The war had turned men into shadows, and even the most fanatical of generals felt the weight of uselessness. Out of 10 soldiers, scarcely one could lift a sword. The others collapsed under the burden of hunger, disease, and distrust. The Gorduy, the giants who had once descended from the stars as guardians, were now nothing but distorted stone figures. Their colossal power remained untouched, but each battle consumed them, and their boundless bodies bore deep scars. Like torn mountains, they had never known defeat, but neither victory. For every city overthrown, for every human army brought to its knees, they felt the growing emptiness that split their hearts. "We came to bring balance," the voice of one of their elders sometimes spoke. "But instead of balance, we brought ruin." The stone of memory sings to us the words of generations, but its song is now mingled with weeping. Eryon-Tal, the sacred stone of Gorduy's memory, was growing heavier. When it was lifted by the Bridge of Light or the Witness of Life, images of the past erupted with heartbreaking intensity. Temples raised in the deserts, pyramids that sent their peaks to the stars, oaths to protect life. All seemed now buried under blood and smoke. The Elyrians, the people of light, had retreated in silence. The power of their thought, which had once been enough to stop armies, could no longer extinguish the fire in the minds of men. Every evening, in hidden sanctuaries, they lit the Elyrs, the sphere of knowledge, to look into the future. But the picture was always the same: ruin, ash, lost children. The light of the spheres trembled weaker and weaker, as if their very essence was tired. "We cannot force peace," said their leader. "We have learned that the power of the mind cannot change the heart. 100 years we have tried. Perhaps what remains is only to wait, for men to extinguish themselves." But not all Elyrians thought the same. Among them, some remembered the oath they had made with the Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life. They still believed in a reconciliation, even though all seemed lost. In the midst of this century of pain, the two men once kidnapped, transformed into symbols, still lived. They were not the same as they had been. Eryon-Tal, the Bridge of Light, was shattered by his sacrifice. His once shining body now seemed like a cracked vessel through which sparks slowly escaped. She moved with difficulty, and every step was a struggle. But she still breathed, she still watched. Sael-Rien, the Witness of Life, was stronger than she had ever been. She had gathered around her a community of survivors, the children of the stars, born not of noble blood or extraterrestrial powers, but of the simple desire to live otherwise than through hatred. She had educated them, fed them, taught them to sing even in the midst of ruins. Her eyes burned with fatigue, but also with a light that still lived, a flame that refused to go out. And yet, after 100 years, something new was felt in the air. Silence. The fronts that had once resounded with cannons and shouts were now deserted, and the valleys where titanic battles had been fought, the wind raised only dust. The armies no longer existed. The generals had collapsed either under the weight of their own ambitions or under the blade of betrayal, and the fortresses of resistance were nothing more than skeleton walls and a few listless survivors. Even the shadow of the rebels, those who had raised the Black Azoth as a weapon, were now lost, shattered. Their power had turned. Against them, decomposed bodies, shattered minds, tribes of ghosts wandering aimlessly. For the first time in 100 years, the weapons had fallen silent. Not from a treaty, not from a clear victory, but from exhaustion. Humanity could no longer. The Gorduy no longer wanted to. The Elyrians had nothing left to influence. There was a strange, oppressive silence, like the deep breath before a new beginning or a total end. In this silence, the Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life stepped amidst the ruins of the world. They were no longer greeted with cheers, nor with stones, but with eyes naked. People looked at them without knowing what to think. "Why fight any more?" asked a skeletal woman, holding a child's hand. "We have nothing left, and no houses, no land, no sky. What have we gained?" Her question was the echo of all humanity. Even the most fanatical warriors, who had spent their lives in the name of fighting, now looked in amazement at their own trembling hand. The silence of the weapons was a bitter victory. It did not bring the promised peace, but only emptiness. But in that void, the Witness of Life saw a chance. "When the noise disappears," she told the assembled, "the whisper remains. And in the whisper can sprout life again. If you are tired of fighting, then it is time to live." Her words were not met with applause. But for the first time, they were not rejected. In the general silence, they remained suspended, like seeds carried by the wind. For Gorduy and the Elyrians, the silence of arms was also a crossroads. The giants gathered their wounds and considered whether to retreat to the stars, leaving the land to men. The Elyrians looked at their spheres, which now showed not only destruction, but also a thin thread of light. "Perhaps it is time for us to cease being gods among mortals," said one of their elders. "Perhaps it is time for us to be just witnesses, and for them to learn alone, even if they fall again." The chapter marks the end of the noise and the beginning of a silence full of possibilities. There is no peace, no full understanding, but there is a respite after a century of madness. Humanity is broken, but not erased. Gorduy and the Elyrians are tired, but not gone, and the Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life remain there, amidst the ruins, like two fragile flames that refuse to go out. The silence of the weapons is the beginning of a new trial, where the real fight is no longer against giants or men of light, but against despair. Chapter 22. The Valley of Silence. In the heart of an earth torn by wars and darkened by centuries of hatred, there was an unknown valley, hidden between mountains covered in ash and forests that no longer sang in the breeze. It was a silent valley, unshadowed by the sound of weapons and untouched by the thirst for power. No one had dared to tread it in centuries of battles, for it was said to be the place where the echo of the gods resounds. Here, in the Valley of Silence, a meeting would take place that could decide not only the fate of men, but also the existence of the fragile alliance between Gorduy and the Elyrians. After a century of fire and blood, after fallen fortresses, poisoned oceans and fields transformed into tombs, the last human leaders understood that neither victory nor conquest were possible. Humanity was on the edge of the abyss, finished by its own stubbornness. The earth had become a tired, torn body, demanding peace. Thus the call to the Valley of Silence arose. It was not an imposed decree, but a collective murmur, a deep need to stop the storm. The leaders of the people set out for the meeting place, each carrying the burden of the past in their eyes. Generals who had led their armies to their deaths, kings of kingdoms without peoples, rulers whose capitals were now only ruins submerged in swamps. Each of them came accompanied by a handful of skeletal soldiers, more shadows than men. They were no longer proud warriors, but remnants of broken nations. From the northern horizon descended the Gorduy, colossal giants whose silhouettes rose like mountains above the scorched fields. They had come not in armor, but in simple robes, a sign of a covenant of peace they wished to make. Their footsteps shook the earth, but they no longer carried the echo of threat, but the solemn vibration of solemn witnesses of history. And from the sky descended the Elyrians, shrouded in blue auras. They brought no weapons, but only the luminous sphere of Elyrs and fragments of the ancient songs of the stars. Through their presence, the silence of the valley became almost sacred. When the three peoples met in the middle of the valley, the silence was so deep that every breath seemed like a spoken word. Neither spoke at first. The humans, the Gorduy, and the Elyrians looked at each other, as beings who only then understood the burden of the past. The humans remembered their cities collapsed under the fists of the giants. The Gorduy remembered their brothers fallen in pointless battles, crushed by human weapons. The Elyrians remembered the endless efforts to stop the massacres through thought, and their bitter failures. In this silent gaze, the past was exposed like an open wound, without words, without accusations. From the ranks of the Elyrians, Sael-Rien, the witness of life, rose. She did not speak with the voice of power, but with the voice of healing. I came here not to bring judgment, but to open the wound and wash it. The earth cries, T asks no more for blood, no more for war, T asks for silence, T asks for healing. Her words flowed like a clear river, and the people looked down. Behind them, the memories of lost children, of scorched fields and dead waters weighed heavier than any word from a stranger. And the Valley of Silence, none of the leaders dared to take up arms. The generals laid their swords on the ground, and their bare hands touched the scorched soil. The Gorduy rested their colossal palms on the ground, and the Elyrians touched the sacred place with their lights. Thus a circle was formed, humans, giants, and stellar beings, united by the absence of violence. It was the first time in 100 years that a moment of absolute silence enveloped the earth. But not all people were ready to give up. Some leaders whispered in secret, "This is just a trap. They will subjugate us and ask us to bow our heads." They were those fed by ancient fear, those who could not conceive that power was not gained by the sword. The Gorduy looked at those fragments of distrust and felt the pain of a history that seemed impossible to wash away. The Elyrians, with their clear minds, let images of the future fall upon people, lands barren, cities burned to ashes, black skies. It was a silent warning. This is the path you will choose if the shadows in your hearts prevail. To seal the meeting, Eryon-Tal, the bearer of Ōrān-Tal, rose and drove the stone of memory into the valley's soil. From it sprang images of the Gorduy past, not only the battles, but also their ancient songs, the temples. Erected in honor of the stars and the vows of peace they had made long before they reached Earth, the same time, Sael-Rien let 𝕭𝖃 float above the circle. The luminous sphere projected possible futures, one of ruin and one of rebirth. Humanity saw that there was still a chance, but only if they agreed to break the chains of hatred. The Valley of Silence became the altar of a new covenant. It was not a treaty written on parchment, not a spoken command. It was an understanding of silence, an oath. Spoken through the absence of violence, through the heavy breathing of those present, through the tears of those who remembered. The last human leaders let the symbols of their power fall to the ground. Crowns, scepters, torn flags, in their place. They received only the promise that the future could be rebuilt. It is said that in that moment, the Valley of Silence itself trembled, the earth breathed easier, and the sky, until then covered with smoke, cleared for a moment. Neither the Elyrians, nor Gorduy, nor the humans knew how to explain that sensation. But everyone understood that that place was not just a space, but a witness to rebirth. When the meeting ended, no one sang victory, no one raised their weapons to the sky. The humans slowly retreated, carrying in their souls the question of whether they would be able to keep their oath. Gorduy and the Elyrians retreated in turn, understanding that the real battle was no longer fought with weapons, but in the hearts of mortals. The Valley of Silence remained untouched, a sanctuary where no soldier's footstep would ever enter, place where silence itself became the heaviest and most powerful weapon of peace. This is the Valley of Silence, the moment when the last shadows of war were cast gathered in one place, and humanity, Gorduy and the Elyrians chose, if only for a moment, to lay down their weapons. But the question remains, can this silence withstand the storm that still smolders in the hearts of men? Chapter 23. The Union of Relics. In the Valley of Silence, where the oath of peace had been sealed by the solemn silence of men, Gorduy and the Elyrians, the sky still carried the echo of that meeting. But what had happened then was only the beginning. Deep in the valley, hidden from the eyes of the uninitiated, stood two relics that had watched over the destinies of the worlds for centuries. Ōrān-Tal, the stone of Gorduy's memory, and 𝕭𝖃, the sphere of light of the Elyrians. Until then, the two had been kept separate, each carrying the burden and blessing of its own civilization. But the time had come when they should be united. Eryon-Tal, the bearer of Ōrān-Tal, had long felt that the stone was beginning to pulsate with an unknown vibration. It was not just a memory of Gorduy's past, but a call to something higher, as if the stone itself wanted to find its match. At the same time, Sael-Rien watched over 𝕭𝖃, and the sphere radiated an unstable light, projecting fragments of contradictory futures, some in which humanity was reborn, others in which everything ended in ashes. The two relics cried out one after the other, although no man could hear them. Only those who carried them in their souls, Eryon-Tal and Sael-Rien, understood that the moment of their fusion had come, and in the middle of the Valley of Silence, a circle of stones was erected, each stone brought by Gorduy from their sacred mountains, and the Elyrians traced shining symbols above that changed their shape according to the rhythm of the cosmos. The people, despite their fear, agreed to stand as witnesses, aware that before them was taking place an act that could change their existence forever. It was not just an alien ritual, but a joining of forces, a reconciliation between two civilizations that had come to Earth as bringers of peace and who were now trying to convey this lesson to people. When Ōrān-Tal and 𝕭𝖃 were brought side by side, the valley vibrated like a giant instrument. The stone, the heavy and dark realm of memory, pulsed with echoes of the past, ancient wars, temples, songs, lost oaths. The luminous, ethereal, and light sphere radiated possible futures, kaleidoscopes of destinies, first approach, the relics repelled each other, emanating waves of energy that made the air tremble. People were frightened, some falling to their knees, convinced that they were witnessing a cataclysm. But Eryon-Tal, Lieutenant Liam, and Sael-Rien Lieutenant Naomi remained unmoved, knowing that this rejection was only the initial test and an act of common will. The bearers approached and united the relics. At the moment of contact, a blinding light engulfed the valley, and all present felt that time and space collapsed. People first saw their past, primitive tribes raising weapons for the first time, kingdoms flourishing, empires falling. They saw their moments of glory, but also their crimes against their own earth. They felt firsthand how the oceans were poisoned, how the mountains were ruined, and how the fire of war consumed their civilization. Then, the united sphere opened up another picture, the possible future, and one scenario. Humanity was repeating its mistakes, building weapons again, erecting walls, and destroying all that was alive. But in another, people were rising alongside Gorduy and the Elyrians, rebuilding fortresses of peace, restoring the rivers, and restoring the song of the forests. Collective murmur ran through the valley. For the first time, people were not just looking at what had been, nor just what could be, but understanding the direct connection between their choices and the fate of the planet. Some of the leaders' eyes filled with tears. The same kings and generals who had ordered massacres now saw the faces of lost children, not just as memories, but as living accusations. Others watched with fear. The future of peace seemed harder to bear than that of war, because it meant giving up power. But in the midst of the crowd, simple people, women, old people, surviving children, began to kneel and stretch their hands towards the light of the united relic. They did not ask for weapons, but a chance to live. The union of Orenttal and Elyrsale created a new force, the Bridge of Life, a ray that rose from the earth to the sky, uniting matter and spirit. Around the ray, the air had become clean, and the burnt grass began to show the first signs of green. The earth reacted. It was as if the planet itself had been waiting for this moment to regain its pulse. The Gorduy fell to their knees, recognizing that the united relic was above even their ancestral oaths. The Elyrians sang a cosmic hymn, a vibration that spread through everyone's minds, banishing for a moment of fear. However, not all were touched by the revelation. Some of the people, those leaders who could not conceive of a future without domination, retreated into the shadows. They whispered among themselves that the relic could be used as a weapon, that its light could subjugate even the giants of Gorduy and the star beings of Illyria. This thought had already sown the seeds of a new conspiracy. But even in the face of this shadow, most people felt for the first time that they were no longer alone. A final wave of light. The united relic showed not only the past and future of people, but also the truth about their connection to the two civilizations. Gorduy and the Elyria had not come as gods, nor as masters, but as a mirror. They were the projection of what humanity could become, untamed strength and cosmic wisdom. But the final choice did not belong to them, but only to people. The light of the relic spoke, not through words, but by vibration. What you have seen is your choice, we cannot decide. Only you. When the light faded, Orenttal and Elyrsale remained fused, forming a shining core that floated above the ground, like a small sun. The Valley of Silence had become a living altar, a place where people could come to see with their own eyes their past and future whenever they lost their way. People left the valley in silence, not as defeated, not as victorious, but as witnesses of a revelation. Gorduy and the Elyrians understood that the real battle was just beginning, the one for the hearts of people, so that the light of the relic would not be used as a weapon, but as a guide. The union of the relics marked the moment when the past, present, and future intertwined in a single vision. There was no turning back. Humanity had seen the truth, and now it had to decide, Will she follow the path of healing, or will she let the shadows overwhelm her again? Chapter 24. The Final Oath. The Valley of Silence, once a place of ruin and suffering, had now become the spiritual center of the earth. There, under a sky still scarred by a century of fire and blood, rose a pillar of light born from the fusion of the relics of Eryon-Tal and Elyrians. Was a shining column, suspended between Earth and cosmos, uniting the roots of the planet with the stars. The humans, the Gorduy, and the Elyrians had gathered for the last time at the foot of this ray. All felt that the decisive moment had arrived. The war could no longer continue, and peace could no longer be a simple political declaration. It needed a symbol, a covenant capable of closing the wounds of the past and offering a future. In the middle of the sacred circle stood the bridge of light and the witness of life. They were not only witnesses to this epic, but also the bridge through that three worlds, human, Gorduy, and Elyrian, could become one. Eryon-Tal, bridge of light, bore visible traces of her sacrifice. Her body was marked by luminous fractures, a sign of that moment in which she had detached herself from her own being to stop the nuclear catastrophe. Each scar radiated a gentle light, like a healed but never forgotten wound. Sael-Rien, witness of life, seemed carried by an inner force that the war had only strengthened. Her face was serene, but her eyes shone with the intensity of those who had seen too much loss to be deceived by illusions. In her hands, the united relic levitated gently, like a cosmic heart pulsing to the rhythm of the earth. Around, the Gorduy stood like colossal, solemn, each with their foreheads touching the earth that had nourished them since the dawn of time. The Elyrians, beings of light, floated like living torches, forming concentric circles that rose to the sky. The people, though exhausted, stood erect. Even the children born in war, who had known no other reality, looked with wide eyes, as if finally discovering that there was another way. The bridge of light took the first step forward. His voice, though human, carried the echo of Gorduy and the vibration of the Elyrians. I raised my weapons, I shed blood, I cried tears that the earth itself absorbed. I saw oceans transformed into fire and cities turned to ash. I looked into the eyes of the Gorduy giants and the Elyrian sons of light and understood that we were not enemies. The enemy had always been our fear, our pride, our desire for power. Today, before the united relic, I pronounce my final oath. The witness of life followed, raising the relic above his head. Its light poured over the entire valley, penetrating the hearts of all. I have tended wounds, gathered orphan children, seen death up close, and understood that life is the only gift that matters. We can no longer live against each other, but only through each other. I, the witness of life, pronounce my final oath. They both then spoke together, words that were not just words, but vibrations that were imprinted in the fabric of reality. We swear, in the name of memory and light, to be the bridge that unites and the witness that watches. We swear that Earth will no longer be the battlefield of fear, but the temple in which Gorduy, the Elyrians and humans will share their gifts. We swear that life will be protected, and the memory of the fallen will live on, as a warning and as a blessing. We swear that we will no longer let the shadows lead us, but we ourselves will be the light that shows the way. We swear that from now on, peace will not be a choice, but itself the law of our being. As the last words were spoken, the relic exploded in a shower of sparks that did not burn, but healed. Its waves swept over the scorched fields, where the first flowers began to sprout. The poisoned waters became clear, and the birds that had fled the war returned. The Gorduy lifted entire rocks and placed them in a circle around the radius, building a sanctuary that would last as long as the planet itself. It was their gift to humanity, a foundation of stone, stable and immortal. The Elyrians raised a crown of light above the sanctuary, a subtle network that vibrated with the energy of the stars, protecting the place from any threat. It was their gift, cosmic wisdom, an invisible shield. The people, with empty hands but full hearts, planted seeds around the sanctuary. It was their gift, the promise of life, of renewal. But in that very moment of peace, the shadows had not completely disappeared. Some of the former generals, who had plotted to use the relic as a weapon, had withdrawn into silence, vowing to wait for the right moment to regain their power. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life knew this. Their oath was not an absolute guarantee, but a path. In each generation, people would be tempted by the shadows. But the relic, the sanctuary, and the oath remained as beacons, reminding them that the light could always be found. The Valley of Silence became a sacred place, and the years that followed, pilgrims, be they human, Gorduy, or Elyrians, came to stand under the pillar of light and listen to the echo of the oath. And every time, the echoes said the same words: "Peace is not a gift received. Peace is a vow renewed." Thus, the final vow was not only of the Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life. T became the vow of all humanity. T is the moment of spiritual climax of the epic. After a century of war and suffering, after sacrifices and revelations, the final vow consecrates a new era. But peace is not perfect peace. It carries within itself the scars of the past and the fragility of the present. The Bridge of Light and the Witness of Life do not become gods, nor leaders, but guardians of memory and life, uniting three civilizations under the same covenant. Chapter 25. A New Era. The last chapter of the Century of War does not open with fanfare, nor with triumphs, but with a heavy silence, which hovered over an earth changed forever. No victory could be celebrated, for what was left behind was a mixture of scars, ruins, and broken souls. And yet, in this silence, behind the pain, the germ of a beginning, of a new era, was felt. The once lively cities no longer existed except as skeletons of stone and metal of the great metropolises. Only a few ruins remained standing, but even they seemed to be crying. The walls were burned, the streets cracked, and everywhere a new, wild vegetation grew, as if the earth wanted to reconquer its territories. The people who still took shelter among the ruins had learned to look at the earth differently, not as a resource to be exploited, but as a fragile sanctuary that needed to be protected. The Gorduy giants, who once crushed fortresses with a single move, now walked among the survivors with rare and cautious steps. They were not the same. Their heavy gazes carried the burden of guilt. Within them lived the memories of all the battles and countless lives lost, and the stone of memory, Eryon-Tal, still vibrated with the echo of the cries of pain of the Iron Age. The Elyrians, the people of light, had diminished their presence. They no longer used the power of thought to dominate or defend, but to heal. Their brilliance was no longer a force of fear, but a comfort. They walked among villages and huts, placing their hands on the foreheads of the sick and dispelling suffering. But even so, people looked at them with suspicion. The wounds of the past do not heal quickly, and the memories of war hung like shadows between every look and gesture. The survivors were different from their ancestors. Those who had lived through the war had been raised in fanaticism, hatred, and fear. But the generations born amidst the ruins had seen only suffering and the meaninglessness of violence. They had learned, instinctively, that war could no longer be the way forward. These new people built their shelters from stone and wood, but also from fragments of molten steel and old ruins. From the shattered pieces of the past, something was born that belonged to no previous era. Mixed civilization was being built, in which the remnants of Earth technology combined with the gifts of the Elyrians and the giant stones of Gorduy-Eryon-Tal, the Bridge of Light, and Sael-Rien, the Witness of Life, were now figures of legend, but they still lived among men. They were no longer just defenders of the Alliance. They had become the bridge between the past and the future. The Bridge of Light walked through the villages like a monk wanderer. His eyes still bore the pain of his sacrifice. The memory of the energy burned when he had stopped the nuclear catastrophe. Was no longer fully human, nor fully anything else. He was a mixture of light and flesh, spirit and matter. But it was precisely this state that made him listen. People saw in him proof that peace could be paid for with the ultimate price and yet preserved. The witness of life shone with another kind of power. She had gathered around her survivors, the children of the stars, whom she had raised not only as people, but as seeds of a new era. She taught them to write, to read, but also to feel, to understand the connection between life, light, and earth. For these children, Sael-Rien was more than a teacher. She was the mother of a reborn humanity. Øryon-Tal and Elyrians, relics of the two civilizations, had been united in a single core of memory and knowledge. This core pulsed at the center of a sanctuary built in the Valley of Silence, the place where weapons had stopped after 100 years. Every night, the core projected images of the past and the future, reminding people of what they had been and what they could become. Whoever stood before it could neither lie nor hide. There, the truth showed itself empty and painful. Many cried, many fled, but all returned. Because without the truth, the world could no longer move forward. The new era was no longer the people's alone, nor of Gorduy or the Elyrians. It was an inevitable mix. The giants shared their knowledge of their constructions, and from their memory stones lessons of resistance and balance were learned. The Elyrians brought the power of thought, but not to dominate, but to lift wounded souls. People, in return, brought their will to survive, stubborn adaptation, which even after 100 years of fire had not been extinguished. Of these three roots something new is taking shape. There was no longer a single race, but a civilization in which differences could not be erased, but could be woven into a painful and beautiful mosaic. And yet, above all this, fragility hovered. No one forgot the century of war and the songs of children, in the prayers of the elderly, in the gazes of those who had seen death with their own eyes. War still lived. Peace was a trembling banner, held in bleeding hands. Any spark could reignite the flames. But, at the same time, every moment of silence was a gift. People had learned, at the cost of their own blood, that peace is not given, but preserved, day after day. With patience and wisdom, new era did not mean a perfect world. It meant a fragile, but living world. From the ruins of the old civilization, new walls were rising, but not of stone or steel, but of oaths, memories, and hopes. The bridge of light and the witness of life watched from a hilltop as the sun rose over a city rebuilt from the pieces, and in their eyes there was no longer only pain, but also the peace of a fulfilled promise. They had failed to save the old world, but they had helped to birth a new one. Epilogue. A century passed like a cosmic breath, leaving behind a planet forever changed. The earth was no longer the same. The oceans had receded, the sky still bore the scars of energy burns, and the continents had been redrawn by the forces of a war that had surpassed human understanding. The war of civilizations had no victor. There was no parade, no true truce. Only the cold silence of the ruins and the echo of the lost. The Gorduy retreated to Antarctica, to their ancient stone sanctuaries, vowing never to interfere in the affairs of men. The Elyrians rose silently to the sky, carrying with them the last memories of a planet that could have been a paradise. But not all left. 𝕿𝖂 remained. Eryon-Tal, the bridge of light, and Sael-Rien, the witness of life, chose to remain among men. They understood that humanity, although weak and contradictory, it carries within it a spark that not even a millennium of wars can extinguish, the desire to know, to forgive, and to begin again. From the ashes of the conflict, a new generation was born, the children of earth and the stars. They no longer had hatred in their eyes, but questions. They no longer wanted weapons, but wisdom. Under the pale sky of a reborn world, these descendants of the three civilizations, humans, Gorduy, and Elyrians, began to build together. Not empires, but bridges, and his last words, Eryon-Tal wrote on a crystal tablet, buried under the South Pole. Those who come after us should not forget, light and shadow are one, and war never brings understanding. Beyond the ice, beyond fear, there is only one world, the one we create together. When the cold winds of Antarctica blows over the ruins of ancient cities, it is said that echoes of light can still be heard, the memory of a lost alliance. But for those who believe, this is not the end. Is only the beginning of a new era, in which Earth and the stars will once again speak the same language. The language of hope.